Family first. It's a noble goal.
They are all into each other. The love is something special.
But what happens when you're stuck between the family you're born into and the one you create?
They isolated themselves and actually became more enmeshed with each other.
Does blood truly run thicker than water? Or can the allure of romantic love ultimately wash all those lifelong loyalties away?
He's under a tremendous amount of pressure now to take care of all of them. They are now a family of 6. Hard to do when you're underemployed.
She sought to have those children live with their biological father, and she didn't like that.
She allegedly asked, does she know any shooters who can take her out?
September 11th, 2017, Detroit, Michigan. It's just before dawn on a Monday morning in America's Motor City.
Detroit is a city of hustle and bustle. Yes, we have blight, yes, we have crime, but I see Detroit as a movement.
You know, you always have that small element of crime, and I don't think that any city can get away from it.
For Detroit police, the day is already off to an urgent start when an emergency call comes in from the city's west side at 6:30 a.m. The caller is a local resident named Walter Knight. He's calling about Tiffany Hunter, the mother of his child.
Tiffany and Walter had a very close relationship, even though they were no longer in a dating relationship.
Walter tells the dispatcher he had grown worried about Tiffany in the middle of the night and decided to check on her.
Walter heard nothing from Tiffany, and he became concerned. He called continually, and there was no response. Walter went to Tiffany's home.
He has a key to the house. He owns the house.
As Walter searched the house for Tiffany, he became more and more uneasy. Something was wrong.
When he walks in, then he finds her lying in a pool of blood.
It was very traumatic. It was blood everywhere. It seemed that she had been brutally assaulted.
Walter tells police to send help fast, so they dispatch officers to Walter's location right away.
When emergency crews arrived, they told him the news that he never thought he would hear. Tiffany was dead. What happened to Tiffany? Who would do this?
41-year-old Tiffany Hunter was a beloved member of her community, known for her lively personality and endless creativity.
She was a mother and a wife and was trying to start her own business. Tiffany wanted to be her ear, nose, and throat specialist.
But the road to opportunity hadn't always been so clear for Tiffany. Growing up in Mobile, Alabama, she faced her share of challenges after an unplanned pregnancy at just 15 years old.
You can handicap yourself by having children early. It doesn't mean that's the end of the story. It just makes things very difficult for you to get past or overcome those circumstances. That was the situation that Tiffany found herself in.
To support her daughter Amber, Tiffany had to forego college for a job in retail. But over the years, she learned to make the best of it.
Despite some obstacles, she became a manager, a leader, and she also had more kids following her first child.
Tiffany had never been really lucky in love. Both of her children's fathers had not stuck around, and she was left to fend for herself.
She put all of her energy into her kids. They were her world. She didn't have anyone else.
She was especially close to the oldest, Amber. As such a young mom, they practically grew up together. Still, the desire to complete her college degree was always there for Tiffany. Shortly before her 30th birthday, she decided to go for it and moved her family to Detroit. Soon after landing in her new city, Tiffany thought she'd found love in Walter Knight.
Eventually, the relationship blossomed, which led to the birth of her third child, another daughter.
But her romance with Walter was ultimately short-lived.
For whatever reason, their relationship didn't exactly work out, but Walter still had the wherewithal to look out for Tiffany, making sure that the mother of his child and his child still had a place to live.
Walter owned the house that Tiffany and her kids were living in. So Walter was still in Tiffany's life. Tiffany tried her best to get back into the dating world and even had one more child, Martha. But with all of her energy going into her 4 kids, there was rarely time for anything else.
This was only compounded when Tiffany's daughter Amber started a family of her own. Now she has not only her own kids, but Amber and her boyfriend's children living there too.
By the fall of 2017, however, Tiffany's load was starting to get lighter. Amber and her boyfriend had moved out and gotten a place of their own, and the rest of Tiffany's children were all teenagers or older. They didn't need as much attention from her anymore. For the first time in forever, Tiffany was finally able to focus on herself.
She had just completed her bachelor's degree, Marygrove College, and she was going back for her master's.
She also just started dating a new guy named Noah.
Tiffany saw Noah as a strong presence and looked at him as a protector. She was just starting to feel out where the relationship could go, but she was really attracted to him.
Here Tiffany is in her second act. She's in her prime. She's flourishing.
But now, the beloved mother and grandmother has been found on the floor of her dining room, lying in a pool of blood. And her ex-boyfriend, Walter, is a total wreck.
The officers at that point, they secure the scene as best as they can. They start to make notifications. One of those notifications is to homicide. I get there, I go to where my partner was, and I can see the victim on the floor. She was laying on top of a pillow.
When they looked at the condition of Tiffany's body, they also realized that she was stabbed multiple times, almost 70 times. Who takes the time to stab someone and then put a pillow beneath their head?
My mindset was like, this is a rage thing, to stab a person. In my opinion, once or twice, okay, I didn't mean to do it. I kind of lost control of myself. But anything over 10 is suggesting that you are very angry and that you really want this to hurt this person.
It was very emotional. It was very intentional. This was a very personal murder. Who would do this? Why?
41-year-old Tiffany Hunter had moved to Detroit to fulfill her dreams.
She managed to raise her children, and then she attempted to start or do a restart of her life and going back to school.
But now, her ex-boyfriend, Walter Knight, has walked into a nightmare. And Detroit police have no doubt they are working with a homicide.
She was a very well-respected person in her community and at work. So to see that happen to a person like that, it's like, why? Why does that take place?
She was stabbed in the face and in the head. It looks like they had to be from a knife. They also noticed that there's some blunt force trauma to the back of her head from a hammer or some other blunt force instrument.
Your mindset is, who has access to do this? We know nobody broke in on her because the door wasn't kicked. You can, see a little bit of disarray in the house. Blood stain on the floor, blood stains in the kitchen.
There in the kitchen, police find a promising piece of evidence.
We couldn't find a murder weapon, but we did find a lot of blood, as if somebody was trying to maybe wash it off. It was blood on the handles, the faucet. It was blood up underneath the sink on cleaning products and stuff like that. We swabbed blood. We took a lot of samples that we thought DNA was on.
A lot of times when you have a stabbing victim, the killer ends up cutting himself in the process. So it is possible that this blood could be more than just the victim's DNA. It could also be the killer's.
But it takes a while for that information to come back, the DNA testing to be done.
In the meantime, investigators build their potential suspect list.
There was no signs of forced entry in the home. This wasn't an armed robbery. It wasn't a robbery gone bad. It was someone that she knew. and someone who was very, very upset with her.
The only person at that time who had access, the ability to get in, was Walter. He had a key to the house, which he owns, by the way. And it was easy to look at that and say, we need to take a deep dive into this person.
Police start out by asking Walter about the last time he saw Tiffany. Walter says Tiffany had come over for dinner at his place Saturday night. The evening went late, so he offered to let her stay in his guest room.
Walter cares about Tiffany. He didn't want her leaving his house at an odd time of night, so she stayed the night. And then the next day they were supposed to go to their respective churches.
On Sunday morning, Tiffany left his house as planned. Walter says he had no idea it was the last time he would ever speak to her.
This is a very good friend, a former lover, former girlfriend, and the mother of his child, where he knew something wasn't right.
Unable to sleep, Walter says he got up around 4 a.m. Monday morning and headed for Tiffany's house. But it's this detail that brings more questions for police.
Walter had to be very, very concerned to go there at 4 o'clock in the morning. Why not wait till a decent hour in the morning?
He's telling police that he woke up around 4 a.m. worried, but he didn't call police until about 6:30 a.m. that morning. So what was he doing all of that time?
Apparently his car breaks down, so he borrows his mother's car to get over there.
After that happened, he makes it to the house, uses his key to get in, and then he discovers her deceased.
The fact that she had spent the night with him the night before is a little suspect, and that you don't call the police to do a well-being check. You go check on her yourself, but at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we already know that there's no signs of forced entry there.
Walter is telling police that Tiffany's children are all spread out these days, and she doesn't see them that much. So the odds of one of them being the ones that entered into the house was unlikely.
Their suspicion towards Walter only increases when he asks them who he thinks could be responsible for Tiffany's murder. That's when the grieving ex-boyfriend suddenly shuts down.
Walter not speaking to the police is actually a code of conduct in the streets, especially in the Detroit community.
Police know they aren't making any more leeway with Walter until he gets some rest.
He's tired, he's emotional, but so far police are not able to uncover anything that would prove that he's guilty. With almost 70 stab wounds, you would think that there would be like a speck of blood or something that he forgot to clean up. So the police had no choice but to let him go.
By now, the sun is starting to rise over the city, and residents of Tiffany's tight-knit community are beginning to wonder what's going on.
It was a decent neighborhood, very walkable. It was one of those neighborhoods where you can get out with your dog and your family.
Investigators start to canvass the neighborhood. Did anyone see anything? Did anyone hear anything?
The first thing we're looking for is who has a doorbell cam, who has surveillance on the outside, security cameras on the outside, but there were none. On the morning of September 10th, her neighbor described hearing screams from the house and then looking out of the window, but didn't see anything crazy, no cars speeding off, nothing that stood out to her as unusual other than hearing those screams. But she had the wherewithal to text Tiffany to say, hey, are you okay? She didn't receive a response, and it just kind of dissipated from there.
Police began to ask about coming and going of other people who've come to the house, and the neighbors able to give some information to the police about someone that Tiffany had been dating, a person by the name of Noah.
After finding the body of 41-year-old Tiffany Hunter stabbed to death, Detroit police have been on the hunt for a suspect.
Her daughter Amber was busy with a family of her own, and her other kids were grown. Tiffany was starting a new chapter in her life, and it made it hard to track down those new people that were in her life.
Now, a neighbor of Tiffany's has brought a new person of interest to light. Her boyfriend, Noah Harmon.
There were rumors that Noah was physically abusive towards Tiffany. She was spending time with men in her life like Walter to help create distance from Noah so that she could feel safe.
When you get a person on your radar, or when a person of interest comes into the scene, we do a full workup on them. You know, we want to know what his criminal history was. if he was capable of doing this thing.
And that caused the police to look even deeper into Noah.
Eager to know more about Tiffany's latest love interest, police bring Noah Harmon in for an interview.
He came on his own free will. He was very emotional. We have this thing in the police department. The person who fighting for his life, the person that's telling me stuff that I didn't even ask about, that happened 2 months and 2 years ago, yeah, he probably the person that's innocent. Noah was that guy.
Until the conversation starts to turn and it looks like now you're treating me or talking to me like I'm a suspect. And then he becomes defensive. I had nothing to do with the death of Tiffany.
Eventually, Noah insists he's done talking. So police turn to another popular investigative tool, the polygraph.
Now, what's interesting about this is that Noah actually fails this test. But it's important to note that failing a polygraph test is not indicative of guilt.
A lot of times the police would get a person to take a polygraph test, and if they fail it, then they confront them with it, and then ultimately, with a little more prodding, they come out with what the truth is. Well, Noah still held fast to his story that he had nothing to do with the death of Tiffany. He very convincingly was telling the police, look, I failed the polygraph test, but take my DNA.
Police agreed to take a sample of Noah's DNA and send it off for testing.
Forensics, on a case like this, or in most cases now, technology is your friend, right? So we were able to get his phone based on his information, where he was, who he was with. It was clearly obvious that he was not there.
There is one man police know was at the scene, Walter Knight. And as more time goes by, investigators keep coming back to the likely killer being one of these two men.
That's what we were doing. We were weighing it. Who's cooperating and who's not? Who's being elusive and who's telling the truth?
Walter said he had nothing to do with it, and even though we have him coming to our house at 4 o'clock in the morning with a key, but she's in a relationship with someone else. So it kind of brings everybody into the fold. Somebody's not telling the truth here as to what happened. One of these guys looks like they are the responsible one.
Police decide to bring both men back in for a follow-up interview. When they sit down with Noah, he once again seems willing to cooperate with police.
Noah did not pass his polygraph test, but he was compliant with the investigation. Noah was very forthcoming and wanted to engage with the investigators to be able to help solve this murder.
While the subject of his relationship with Tiffany had been difficult for Noah to discuss, when talk turns to her ex-boyfriend Walter, Noah doesn't hold back.
Noah identified that Walter and Tiffany had also had a history of conflict.
We have to dig a little deeper to see what's actually going on here. In doing so, we find out that the relationship with Walter and Tiffany wasn't all that great either.
Noah was able to identify it to the police that there was ongoing conflict and even violence that occurred throughout their relationship. So she decided to take out a protection order.
But an unforeseen twist in the case left everyone questioning. Detroit homicide detectives are taking a closer look at two men that were in Tiffany Hunter's life at the time of her murder. But so far, it's been hard to build a case against her boyfriend, Noah Harmon.
Yeah, he had a checkered past, but did he have the means to do this? And does his checkered past mean that he has the accessibility to do this? And we found those answers to be no.
Noah actually had an alibi where he was with another woman.
When it comes to Tiffany's ex-boyfriend Walter Knight, however, police are learning it's an entirely different ballgame.
The key factor in this is this protective order against him. Why would Tiffany do this? What were the challenges in this relationship that led her to feel not safe around him?
Noah had shared with law enforcement that Tiffany was concerned because previously Walter had overstepped the boundaries, entered the home, and also threatened her because she was entertaining other men.
You have to understand that it was Walter's house that Tiffany was in, and so Walter, from our understanding, he didn't like that.
When police confront Walter with these accusations, they're shocked to see he doesn't try to deny them.
he told me that he thought it was disrespectful that she had other men in the house. You know, they were still having sexual relationships.
From Walter's perspective, there was no clear boundaries, and in unhealthy relationships, often there is no clear boundaries. Walter felt that he was free to do what he wanted to do.
As Tiffany was working to remove herself from her current love relationship, she found refuge with Walter Knight.
Walter, he admits that we didn't always have the perfect relationship, but that doesn't mean that I would do anything to harm her. In fact, she came to me because I was her place of safety. And that's why she was with me the night before, and that's why I was concerned about not hearing from her.
But when police try to dig in more to his whereabouts that night, once again, Walter starts to shut down.
When we talked to him, where were you? You know, well, I was here. No, you wasn't. Well, okay, I wasn't. Well, where were you? I don't have to tell you that. Did he have to tell us for clarity's sake and for manpower's sake? Yeah, he absolutely should have told us. Every time we engaged this person, it was deception. And so from a police standpoint, you know, what does that look like for us, right? He got to be the guy.
That's when police offer Walter the same deal they made with Noah. Hand us your phone and let technology do the talking.
Walter, you know, he allowed us to extract his phone, to find out, you know, what kind of conversations that they were having, even where he was.
There's one data point in particular that's especially crucial in building Walter's timeline for police.
Walter's alibi was that in the middle of the night he endured some car trouble, and so he had to contact family members in order to provide transportation.
That cell phone information put him there. You know, if you're a savvy person, you know, everybody knows that the police does cell phones now, right? That's a thing, right? Now, everybody knows that, you know, you don't take your cell phone nowhere if you're getting ready to do something that you're not supposed to do. We started getting into his assets, his properties, to figure out what he owned, you know, doing title searches and stuff like that. So we were really scrambling and really trying to connect him to this case. And with the information that we had based on what he was giving us, I truly feel like had we presented a warrant for him, it would have gotten signed.
There's just one more piece of evidence that police need to build their case: DNA. But when the results of blood found at the scene come in, they bring disheartening news.
The DNA was not a match to Walter Knight or Noah Harding.
It's a big blow for investigators who've spent months building a case against Walter.
We were actually going after the wrong person, and it wasn't because we were trying to, you know, railroad him. It was because he had such a disdain for law enforcement, and you know, his position was, I don't have to tell you anything. And because he was so deceiving and untruthful, it was like, okay, he has to be the guy. The worst feeling in the world as a homicide detective, in my opinion, is to work a case and not being able to go to a person's family and say, we got the person that killed your baby. To let a case go cold with no leads is the worst feeling in the world.
5 months after Tiffany Hunter's murder, in February of 2018, an unexpected call promises to break the case wide open.
A few weeks after they are able to establish alibis, they get a tip.
We were in the office and Detective Clemens get a call.
The caller is saying he is very concerned about his daughter. He tells police that he's the father of Tiffany's youngest daughter, Martha. Martha has been devastated since her mother's death, but recently he learned that there is more to the story.
Martha had disclosed to her father that Amber had actually asked her to help kill her mother.
It's been 5 months since 41-year-old Tiffany Hunter was murdered inside her Detroit area home. Now, police may finally be on their way to getting some answers, after a man comes forward claiming his daughter Martha Ferguson knows the killer.
Martha's father contacted the police and disclosed that she was concerned that Tiffany actually was murdered by her daughter.
On February 17, 2018, Martha Ferguson and her father agreed to meet with police and provide a statement.
He brings her in and she lays the whole thing out.
Amber wanted her mother out of her life. She was searching for someone to actually bring her mother to a demise.
Martha says that Amber had always butted heads with her mother. Only 15 years apart in age, Amber sometimes felt like she had a peer when she wanted a parent. Amber had fallen into her mother's same path of getting pregnant at a young age, growing up too fast.
The relationship with her ex-husband, Carl, didn't work out. And at the same time, she needed support from her mom, but she didn't want to take her mom's advice.
Tiffany was always putting pressure on Amber to get a job, pull more weight in her relationship with her boyfriend, Carl, trying to push her daughter out of the nest a bit more, when Amber was feeling like she needed her mom more than ever.
She went through the motions. She got married to her baby father, Carl, and tried to accept this life as her own.
But it wasn't until Amber met her current husband, Javante Wakefield, that her family frustrations turned into fiery hatred.
Javante was someone she felt she could connect to. She felt understood for the first time.
Javante promised to take care of her, completely changed her world around. He was her dream come true.
But Martha says the more time Amber spent with Javante, the more her family began to notice a change in her personality.
They are all into each other. The love is something special. He'll do anything for her. She'll do anything for him. It's just that tight of a bond for them. They're all over social media. They're hugged up. Javante Wakefield may have bitten off a little more that he could chew in getting with Amber and adding to the family, because she comes to the table with 2 children. They have 2 more children together. He's under a tremendous amount of pressure now to take care of all of them. They are now a family of 6. Hard to do when you're underemployed in Mobile, Alabama, so he comes to Detroit looking for opportunity.
In the meantime, they all have to move in with Tiffany.
She felt like Amber should have taken more of an ownership role over her life, as opposed to living with her and having her now husband since 2014 living with her.
But when Tiffany was finally able to push Amber out on her own, Martha says that things only got worse.
There was financial instability, and that often caused conflict. But Amber and Javante did not feel like they had enough support within their family to make some changes. And so they isolated themselves and actually became more enmeshed with each other.
They are living in a state of squalor. They're just barely in a home. They're almost homeless. To add insult to injury, Amber's first husband, Carl, is looking to take his 2 children from Amber because he doesn't like the conditions that they're living in. Amber's mom, Tiffany, is siding with Carl.
She sought to have those children live with their father, their biological father. And Amber didn't like that at all. She didn't like that.
Martha tells police that Amber was convinced this was the happiest she had ever been. She couldn't risk having her mother take it all away.
Amber had let Martha know that she did not want her mother to actually participate in the investigation or the court procedures regarding her against her kids.
That's when Martha says Amber came up with a plan that could keep her family intact, just the way she wanted. According to Martha, Amber was under the impression her mom had a hefty life insurance policy.
Really, the motivation for the money was to please her spouse, Javante. Javante wanted the money.
I'm desperate. I know that Tiffany has a life insurance policy on her life, of which the beneficiary is going to be Amber, her first child. If something happens to Tiffany, then that may be the solution. That may be the answer to all our problems.
Amber tells Martha that she needs to get rid of Tiffany. It's the only way to get the financial freedom that her husband desperately wants. She does not want her mother to go to court to talk against her and Javante when it comes to the co-parenting.
Amber allegedly goes to Martha and asks Martha, does she know any shooters who can take Tiffany out?
But when Martha refused to have any part of it, Amber and Javante were convinced they could carry it all out themselves.
So Martha actually shares with the police investigators that Amber told her on September 9th that they were going to commit the crime.
Amber told Martha that Javante went in through the window of her mother's house, snapping a picture once he was safely inside.
He takes a selfie with a painting in the background that Amber knows is in Tiffany's house to show Amber that I am here and I'm waiting on her to get home.
It was a significant thing because it was in his phone, it was in the tablet, it was in the devices that they were communicating about that Amber's sister told us about. She said, hey, they communicating on tablets and phones through Facebook Messenger or whatever.
Police pull the phone records and find all Martha promised and more. On March 5th, 2018, they are ready to serve warrants to both Amber Hunter and her husband, Javante Wakefield. There's just one problem.
Unfortunately, they can't find Javante and Amber because they're on the run.
At this point, where we had a vision board in the office with Amber's picture on it, they said, I'm going to get you fill in the blanks. That's what our focus was.
Thanks to a tip from Tiffany Hunter's youngest daughter, Martha, police finally have two clear suspects in their sights. Tiffany's oldest daughter, Amber Hunter, and her husband, Javante Wakefield.
Once we got the story from Martha, we started, obviously, it was like, okay, the flame is on now. We were at a simmer, and now we on high.
The Detroit police, coupled with the FBI, zones in on Amber and Javante to bring them back into custody.
And we were getting information. She was paid out the insurance money from her mom's death. And when we started running our cars, it just started coming together.
Soon, police are able to trace the couple miles outside of Detroit to Youngstown, Ohio.
They used that insurance money to start this bakery business in Youngstown. And ironically, that is how we found them. We were able to get on the phone with the authorities in Youngstown, and it just all started coming together. It was like watching a movie for real. You know, it just all started, the pieces were falling in place.
Law enforcement followed the trail to Youngstown, Ohio, where they raid the home of Amber and Javante.
Javante and Amber, they don't put up a fight. They go peacefully. The jig is up. We've been found out. We were living a high life as a result of what we did, but the cost of what we did is about to come into fruition now.
On March 9th, 2018, Javante Wakefield and Amber Hunter are taken into custody and charged with the murder of Tiffany Hunter.
Obviously, we went in and we confiscated all electronic devices because we had got the information from Martha that they were communicating over the electronic devices and Facebook. Detective Clemens and I, we found this letter. The letter was an apology letter to Tiffany saying that I'm sorry for what I did.
But when police bring Javante in for an interview back at the station, he's not as quick to take the blame.
Like I said, then, I'm telling you now, I had nothing to do with it or I have nothing to hide.
He was just kind of like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Okay. What about the text messages you guys were doing over the Facebook and that kind of stuff?
What text messages?
There was some communication between you guys two phones.
I mean, of course, man, we're married, so we're not finished.
No, I understand that. And there's some pictures, you know? How this is ringing a bell?
Pictures?
Yeah, when you were inside the house at Tiffany's house.
What pictures, though?
His position was prove it. I didn't do it. And he stayed there. That was his position.
Can I see my lawyer?
Yeah, if you want to talk to your attorney, I'm done. We can't talk. You know that, right? Okay. Nope, I appreciate it.
As Javante lawyers up and effectively ends communication with police, investigators turn their attention to Amber.
She was very smiley, really nonchalant, kind of like, yeah, I hear you, but no. Politely telling me no. as if she had it all figured out. I probably got about maybe 10 questions in, you know, oh, who's Tiffany Hunter to you? My mom. What's your relationship to Javante? My husband. How long y'all been married? You know, just some general stuff, right? And just before I could get into the meat of it, she was like, yeah, I don't want to talk no more. I want a lawyer.
But when the couple hears their charges announced for the first time in court days later, suddenly, Amber is ready to change her tune.
Then it was like, yeah, this is real.
Amber entered into a plea offer, which was 25 years to 50 years. That's a reduction in the charge from a first-degree murder to a second-degree murder.
A plea agreement, and you get to talk to the prosecutor, and you get to have your come to Jesus moment, and you get to say whatever it is without any further penalty. So the prosecutor will say, okay, I'll give you this, but you got to tell me the truth as to what happens.
During the preparation of the plea agreement, Amber disclosed to investigators that Javante was the mastermind and actually correlated him with the crime.
She's literally throwing Javante under the bus. This was his plan to get my mother's insurance proceeds because of the conditions that we were in. This was all his idea, not mine, his idea.
Amber goes along with Javante's plan because she loves him so much and she feels killing her mother is the only way that they can stay together. Amber doesn't hate her mom. She's motivated by her obsession with Javante and the fact that she does not want to lose him.
That night, Javante climbed in through a window of the home. Then he proceeded to wait for Tiffany to get home.
Tiffany was with Walter. When she left him, she comes home. And Javante strikes her in the back of the head with a hammer. When you're in a rage or when you are uncontrollably doing something, I mean, yeah, 69 times is plausible.
He's in such an adrenaline rush that he didn't realize he cut himself in the process and that he's left DNA all over the crime scene.
Amber says that after he did the murder, he got on the bus. And on the way to the bus, he threw the hammer away. He kept the clothes and put them in bags and got rid of them. You know, he destroyed the evidence. This is what she's saying.
On January 17th, 2019, Amber Hunter pleads guilty to second-degree murder and is sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison.
Once Javante was faced with the reality of the impact of the legal system, he realized that he was not able to actually beat the case because Amber identified him as the mastermind, and he decided to take the plea agreement himself.
More than 2 years later, in April 2022, Javante Wakefield finally accepted a second-degree murder plea as well.
You never really know what really happened. You just, it's always, we call it a three-sided coin. It's Amber's version, it's Javante's version, and then there's the truth.
Javante and Amber actually echoed each other's attitude and behaviors. Even though that they were problematic, both of them encouraged each other and influenced each other to commit the crime.
This was one of those cases where communication would have solved this, but because nobody knew how to communicate in this case, it ended up in the death of Tiffany Hunter. I think if everybody knew how to convey and respect the feelings of everybody else or each other, she would still be here.
What's so unfortunate about this case is that Tiffany never gets to realize her comeback story. All of Tiffany's dreams and aspirations died on that day.
Marriage can bring a new chapter for many. The passing of a baton from your old family to new. But the vow to be together until death do us part takes on a different meaning when you're dealing with murder. The safety and security of the bond you've created can be hard to hold on to when you're separated by bars.
It was an unusually cold October morning in 2002 when the quiet, tree-lined suburban streets of Stark County, Ohio, were shattered by a discovery that would haunt the community for nearly a quarter of a century. A routine autumn morning turned into an absolute nightmare when a passerby noticed an idling sedan parked at the edge of a dense, secluded woodline just off a gravel access road, its driver's side door resting slightly ajar, the headlights cutting uselessly through the thick morning fog. Inside, the lifeless body of 34-year-old mother and local receptionist, Sarah Linwood, lay slumped across the front seats. There was no sign of a struggle outside the vehicle, no broken glass, and no missing valuables visible on the dashboard. But what investigators found inside that damp, fog-choked car set off a firestorm of panic through the quiet Midwestern town. Sarah had been brutally strangled, her life extinguished in a matter of terrifying minutes, leaving behind 2 young children and a family consumed by immediate, unspeakable grief. Within hours, local law enforcement transformed the quiet suburban road into a massive, tape-encircled crime scene. Forensic technicians combed every inch of the damp gravel, dusting the vehicle doors for latent fingerprints, collecting fiber samples from the upholstery, and securing the victim's personal belongings for immediate processing. Yet, despite the swift and aggressive response from state and local detectives, the crime scene offered agonizingly few immediate answers. There were no foreign footprints in the mud, no discarded murder weapon, and no obvious sign of forced entry. Whoever had met Sarah Linwood on that isolated access road had either been welcomed into her car or had approached with such familiarity that she never saw the danger coming. Headlines across Ohio immediately ignited with shocking bulletins. Cold-blooded murder in Stark County, mother of 2 found strangled in idling car, and killer on the loose in quiet, suburban neighborhood. The community, accustomed to unlocked doors and peaceful evening walks, collapsed into an atmosphere of suffocating paranoia. As the initial days of the investigation turned into exhausting weeks, detectives zeroed in on Sarah's inner circle, painstakingly interviewing friends, coworkers, neighbors, and extended family members. Every lead was pursued with relentless urgency. Every potential alibi was scrutinized under the harsh glare of interrogation lights. Suspicion initially fell upon strangers and opportunistic predators, with police launching sweeping canvasses of nearby highways and monitoring local gas station security feeds from the night of the crime. But as the timeline of Sarah's final hours was reconstructed, an unsettling picture began to emerge. Sarah had left her home late in the evening after receiving a brief phone call on the family's landline, a call that lasted less than 45 seconds. She told no one where she was going, grabbed her jacket, and drove out into the night, leaving her purse and wallet sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. Investigators realized with chilling certainty that Sarah had not been picked at random by a roaming predator. She had driven to that dark woodline to meet someone she knew, someone she trusted implicitly, and someone who would ultimately betray that trust in the most lethal way imaginable. Despite collecting crucial physical evidence, including trace biological material recovered from the victim's clothing and fingernails, the technological capabilities of 2002 reached a formidable brick wall. Early DNA testing produced a partial male profile, but when uploaded to state and national offender databases, it returned 0 matches. Year after agonizing year, the case file grew thicker, accumulating thousands of pages of interview transcripts, tips, and forensic reports, yet yielding no concrete suspect. The trail went ice cold. Detectives retired, local headlines faded, and the agonizing void left in the wake of Sarah Linwood's murder hardened into a permanent, painful scar for her surviving family. For 24 long years, the killer walked free, living a normal life, attending holiday dinners and blending seamlessly into society, while Sarah's children grew up in the lingering shadow of an unsolved horror. Then came 2026. Armed with cutting-edge investigative genetic genealogy and advanced touch DNA extraction techniques that were unimaginable at the turn of the century, a specialized cold case task force reopened Case File 02, CR 8819. Scientists reanalyzed the microscopic biological material preserved in frozen storage for nearly 2.5 decades, building a comprehensive, full-spectrum genomic profile. Within weeks, the public database comparison didn't point to a stranger or a known career criminal. It pointed directly into the branches of Sarah's own family tree. In a jaw-dropping twist that sent shockwaves through the entire state, police executed a tactical arrest on a close family member who had sat alongside the grieving family at Sarah's funeral, shedding tears and offering condolences while carrying the darkest secret in Stark County history. The 24-year nightmare was finally over, proving that no matter how deep the betrayal or how many years pass, the truth will always drag the guilty out of the shadows. The autumn chill that hung over Stark County in late October 2002 was not merely a seasonal change. It felt like a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down upon the heart of the entire community. As news of Sarah Linwood's body being discovered inside her idling sedan spread from local radio broadcasts to evening television news bulletins, the initial shock gave way to a visceral, agonizing panic. People who had lived on these quiet suburban streets for decades, people who had never felt the need to deadbolt their front doors or look twice at a passing vehicle, suddenly found themselves staring out their windows into the creeping dusk with a profound, terrifying sense of dread. The local sheriff's department, overwhelmed by the sheer brutality and high-profile nature of the crime, immediately requested assistance from State Bureau investigators, transforming the peaceful rural outpost into an epicenter of intense, round-the-clock forensic activity. Mobile command units were deployed to the edge of the dense woodline off the gravel access road, their high-intensity searchlights cutting through the damp, murky night as technicians meticulously plotted every square foot of the surrounding terrain. Inside the perimeter of yellow police tape, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, unspoken urgency as investigators attempted to piece together the chaotic final moments of Sarah's life. The vehicle itself, a metallic gray four-door sedan, sat motionless on the soft shoulder of the access road, its tires sunk slightly into the wet clay. Every single surface of the interior was analyzed with painstaking care, from the steering wheel cover to the rear seat upholstery. Bloodstain pattern analysts illuminated the cabin with specialized ultraviolet light, searching for microdroplets, fluid transfers, or latent fibers that might reveal the sequence of events inside that tight space. What made the crime scene so deeply perplexing to seasoned homicide detectives was the absolute lack of external violence done to the vehicle itself. The windows were completely intact, the ignition key was turned to the on position, and the fuel tank was running dangerously close to empty, indicating the engine had been idling quietly in the fog for hours before the passerby made the horrifying discovery. As the sun rose over Stark County the following morning, newspapers hit front porches with screaming headlines that underline the town's worst nightmare. Stark County horror. Young mother found murdered in idling sedan. Police hunt for killer after cold-blooded strangulation. And NO suspects in senseless Midwestern tragedy. The local coffee shops, diners, and hardware stores, usually places of warm neighborly gossip, became tense, quiet spaces where people spoke in hushed, guarded tones. Everyone was looking over their shoulder, wondering if a ruthless predator was roaming the quiet country backroads, picking victims at random from the surrounding suburbs. Rumors began to spread like wildfire across the county. Some speculated it was a highway hitchhiker gone wrong. Others feared a serial predator was operating along the interstate corridors, while some insisted it had to be a botched robbery attempt, despite the fact that Sarah's purse and credit cards were found completely undisturbed back at her house. Detectives assigned to lead the homicide task force immediately began the painstaking process of victimology, seeking to understand every detail of Sarah Linwood's daily routine, her relationships, her finances, and her recent interactions. Friends and coworkers described Sarah as a warm, devoted 34-year-old mother who poured her entire life into raising her two young children and working as a dependable receptionist at a local medical office. She had no known enemies, no history of substance abuse, no secret debts, and no erratic behavioral patterns in the weeks leading up to her death. She was, by all accounts, the very picture of suburban stability. Yet, the circumstances surrounding her departure from her home on that fatal night pointed to a singular, undeniable reality. Sarah had not been dragged kicking and screaming from her driveway, nor had she been forced off the road by an aggressive driver. She had voluntarily put on her jacket, stepped out into the cold night air, turned the key in her ignition, and driven straight to a dark, isolated meeting spot in the woods, acting on a sudden, imperative reason that she had shared with no one. The focus of the investigation quickly turned toward the brief, mysterious phone call received on the Linwood family landline just before Sarah disappeared. Phone company records confirmed that an incoming call had connected to the house at 9:42 p.m., lasting precisely 43 seconds. Because the call originated from a public payphone situated outside a gas station 3 miles away on the edge of the highway, investigators were unable to immediately link the line to a specific individual. Detectives rushed to the gas station, impounding security camera tapes and interviewing store clerks who had been on shift that evening. However, the low-resolution analog video feeds of 2002 offered only grainy, shadowed figures moving past the outdoor phone booth under the flickering halogen lights, yielding no identifiable faces or license plate numbers. The killer had chosen a blind spot in the station's surveillance grid, executing a calculated move that demonstrated either extraordinary luck or a precise, chilling familiarity with the area's physical vulnerabilities. As news of the payphone lead leaked to the local press, the atmosphere across Stark County grew exponentially more oppressive. Headlines blasted across Ohio newsstands, "Call from the shadows," payphone linked to strangled mother's final minutes, grainy surveillance feeds leave police hunting phantom caller, and Stark County in fear as mystery deepens. Detectives flooded the area surrounding the gas station, going door to door through neighboring trailer parks, residential streets, and small commercial strip malls, desperately searching for anyone who might have seen a car idling near the public booth or a figure standing under the flickering halogen light around 9:40 p.m. Dozens of tips poured into the sheriff's department hotline every single day, reports of suspicious vehicles, strange men seen walking along the highway, and rumors whispered across office water coolers. Yet each lead was methodically checked, documented, and eventually discarded when it failed to yield a tangible connection to Sarah Linwood's last known movements. Forensic analysis at the State Crime Laboratory in Columbus continued around the clock, with technicians subjecting every scrap of evidence recovered from Sarah's sedan to the most advanced testing available in 2002. Under microscopic examination, investigators recovered microscopic fabric fibers from the passenger seat headrest, as well as several strands of unknown hair clinging to the outer hem of Sarah's winter coat. Most significantly, trace biological material, epithelial cells mixed with minute traces of foreign biological matter, was scraped from beneath the victim's fingernails, proving that in her terrifying final moments, Sarah had fought desperately against her attacker inside that cramped car cabin. However, human DNA technology at the turn of the millennium was severely limited compared to modern standards. The biological sample yielded only a partial, low-quantity male DNA profile, enough to rule out specific individuals if a direct comparison sample was provided, but entirely insufficient to generate a hit on CODIS, the National Offender Database, which required a full 13-marker STR profile to initiate an automated match. With physical evidence providing no immediate name, the task force doubled down on personal interrogations, broadening their scope to include every male acquaintance, distant relative, coworker, and former romantic interest in Sarah's life. Detectives set up an interrogation hub inside the county administration building, sitting down with dozens of men for hours at a time, scrutinizing their alibis, testing their emotional responses, and requesting voluntary swab samples for DNA elimination. Among those interviewed were local delivery drivers, contractors who had recently done work on the Linwood family home, and longtime friends who had grown up in the same neighborhood. Suspicion swung wildly from one individual to another as rumors swept through the community, fracturing friendships and casting long clouds of distrust over once tight-knit social circles. Yet, man after man stepped forward, provided verified alibis backed by time cards, gas receipts, or family member testimonies, and submitted his DNA without resistance, effectively eliminating themselves from the pool of potential suspects. As autumn faded into a bitter, freezing Ohio winter, the investigation hit a wall of overwhelming frustration. The physical crime scene had been thoroughly processed, the payphone video analyzed by federal video enhancement experts to no avail, and the immediate circle of suspects systematically cleared through scientific elimination. The realization began to settle over the sheriff's department and the grieving Linwood family that the killer was not a roving psychopath who would immediately strike again, nor was he an obvious violent offender already known to local law enforcement. He was someone who possessed the cold, calculating discipline to vanish back into normal life without leaving a trace, someone who could watch the news broadcasts, observe the panic gripping the county, and maintain an impenetrable facade of innocence while attending church, working his job, and sitting down to dinner with his own family. Months bled into years, and the intense media glare that had once illuminated every detail of Sarah Linwood's tragic murder began to dim. The screaming headlines were gradually replaced by other local news stories, and the mobile command units were packed up and returned to headquarters. Case File 02, CR 8819 was bound in heavy leather covers, marked with hundreds of color photographs, evidence receipts, and interview logs, and moved from the active desk of the lead homicide detective into the climate-controlled subterranean archives of the department. To the outside world, the file represented a tragic mystery frozen in time, an unsolved Midwestern cold case that served as a cautionary tale about the dark secrets lurking behind suburban doors. But to Sarah's two young children, who grew up passing their mother's empty bedroom and looking at framed photographs on the fireplace mantel, that dusty case file represented an unanswered scream for justice, a promise that no matter how many years slipped away, the monster who stole their mother on that foggy October night would eventually be forced to account for his sins. The passage of time across Stark County did not erase the phantom of October 2002. It merely pushed it beneath the surface of daily life, where it lingered like a dull, persistent ache. By the late 2000s and into the 2010s, the initial shockwave that had rocked the suburban community had settled into a quiet, haunting myth. New families moved onto the tree-lined streets, oblivious to the fact that just 3 miles down the gravel access road, a mother's life had been brutally snuffed out inside an idling car. Local newspapers running anniversary retrospectives every October splashed familiar headlines across their digital archives. Decade later, Stark County mother's murder remains unsolved, the foggy night that changed suburbia forever, and police still hunting for phantom caller in 2002 cold case. Yet, despite the recurring media interest and periodic calls for public tips, Case File 02, CR 8819 remained firmly locked behind the heavy steel doors of the subterranean evidence vault, gathering dust beside decades of unsolved files. Inside the police department, the torch was passed through successive generations of homicide detectives. The original lead investigators who had stood in the freezing damp air on that fateful morning in 2002 eventually reached retirement, packing up their desks and handing off the heavy, leather-bound folders to younger officers. Each new detective who took over the cold case unit approached Sarah Linwood's file with the same mixture of reverence and burning determination. They re-interviewed key witnesses, re-examined the grainy surveillance footage from the gas station payphone using upgraded digital filtering tools, and attempted to run the partial male DNA profile through CODIS whenever new national database updates were rolled out. But the result was always the same heartbreaking dead end. 0 matches found, no new physical leads, and an absolute silence from a community that had exhausted all its answers years ago. Meanwhile, Sarah's children were forced to navigate the crucial milestones of their lives: high school graduations, college acceptances, first jobs, and weddings, with a crushing, unfilled void where their mother's warm smile should have been. Every family gathering, every holiday dinner, and every birthday was quietly shadowed by the painful knowledge that the individual responsible for breaking their family was likely still alive, breathing free air, and walking among them unnoticed. The psychological toll of living under an perpetual cloud of unanswered questions bred a quiet, agonizing hypervigilance. They looked at strangers on the street, distant acquaintances, and even old family friends, plagued by the terrifying thought: could it be you? Did you sit across from us at the funeral? Did you offer your condolences while knowing you were the one who took her? As the years rolled into 2 decades, the science of criminal forensics underwent a silent, revolutionary transformation far beyond the walls of local evidence rooms. The advent of modern molecular biology, high-throughput genomic sequencing, and advanced touch DNA recovery techniques began to fundamentally alter what was deemed unsolvable. Evidence that had been classified as too small, degraded, or contaminated for traditional STR testing in 2002 was suddenly capable of yielding vast amounts of biological data. Across the country, high-profile cold cases that had been dormant for 40 years were suddenly being solved in a matter of months through the power of investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that mapped complex family trees using public consumer DNA databases to track down violent offenders through their distant biological relatives. By the time 2025 gave way to early 2026, a newly formed, federally funded state cold case task force selected Sarah Linwood's murder as a top priority candidate for full genetic genealogy restoration. A team of elite forensic genealogists and molecular biologists descended upon the Stark County evidence locker, meticulously pulling the preserved freezer boxes that held the trace evidence collected from beneath Sarah's fingernails nearly 24 years prior. The stage was set for a scientific assault on a mystery that had defied justice for almost a quarter of a century. The invisible biological ghost left behind on that foggy October night in 2002 was finally about to be dragged into the light, setting off a chain reaction that would culminate in the most unbelievable, heart-wrenching revelation in the history of the county. In the early morning hours of February 2026, a temperature-controlled security van belonging to the State Cold Case Task Force pulled up to the high-security entrance of the Regional Crime Laboratory in Columbus, Ohio. Inside a specialized biohazard container rested the small, sealed evidence box labeled 02 CR 8819 Evidence Swabs. For nearly 24 years, these tiny cotton swabs, containing the microscopic biological residue scraped from beneath Sarah Linwood's fingernails on that tragic autumn morning in 2002, had been maintained in deep freezer storage at -20 degrees Celsius. While technology at the turn of the century could only extract a partial, low-copy male DNA profile that returned endless dead ends on state offender registries, the science of 2026 had advanced into a realm that sounded like science fiction. Scientists were no longer restricted to traditional STR marker analysis. They now possessed single nucleotide polymorphism sequencing, capable of mapping millions of individual genetic markers from a handful of degraded human cells. Inside the sterile environment of the Advanced Genomic Sequencing Lab, geneticists subjected the historical samples to modern touch DNA extraction algorithms and high-throughput biological amplification. Within 72 hours of processing, the ancient biological material yielded an astonishing result, an ultra-high-density genomic profile consisting of over 600,000 SNP markers. This comprehensive digital map of the killer's DNA was immediately uploaded into public investigative genetic genealogy databases, platforms where millions of ordinary citizens had voluntarily submitted their DNA to explore their ancestral heritage. Within minutes of running the automated cross-referencing algorithms, the server monitor lit up with a series of distant biological matches, third cousins, second cousins once removed, and great-aunts who shared distinct segments of identical DNA with the unknown perpetrator of the 2002 Stark County homicide. A team of specialized forensic genealogists immediately began building a massive reverse family tree, working backward through centuries of public marriage records, census documents, birth certificates, and obituaries. The digital web expanded rapidly, connecting disparate branches of Midwestern families that spanned 3 states. Line by line, generation by generation, the genealogists pruned the branches of the family tree, eliminating individuals who were too young, too old, female, or living thousands of miles away at the time of Sarah's murder. By late March 2026, the staggering genetic web had narrowed down to a single, specific ancestral branch rooted right in the heart of Stark County, Ohio, pointing directly toward a tight-knit family unit that lived less than 10 miles from the woodline where Sarah Linwood's idling sedan had been discovered. The shockwave that hit the task force detectives was immediate and terrifying. The genetic trail did not point to an out-of-state transient, a serial predator passing through on the highway, or a stranger met by chance at a gas station. It pointed directly into the surviving inner circle of the victim herself. Detectives stared at the high-resolution family tree displayed on the briefing room whiteboard, where a red marker circled a single name, a close family relative who had stood beside Sarah's grieving children at her funeral in 2002, who had held her mother's hand during memorial services, and who had quietly observed every single anniversary retrospective run by local news channels for 24 years. The monster who had strangled Sarah Linwood on that foggy October night had not vanished into the night. He had remained right in front of everyone, hiding in plain sight behind a mask of grief and familial support. To secure an airtight conviction that could withstand the most intense legal scrutiny, the task force launched a discreet, high-priority surveillance operation to collect a direct, fresh, surreptitious DNA sample from the suspect. Undercover detectives shadowed the target for 5 days as he went about his normal, mundane routine, visiting local hardware stores, driving through suburban neighborhoods, and stopping at a fast food drive-thru on the edge of town. On the 5th day, the suspect discarded a plastic soda cup and straw into a public trash receptacle outside a shopping center. Within seconds of his departure, plainclothes officers secured the discarded item in an evidence bag and rushed it to the state crime lab for emergency expedited testing. 12 hours later, the forensic report landed on the desk of the lead prosecutor. The fresh DNA extracted from the plastic straw matched the killer's profile from beneath Sarah Linwood's fingernails with a scientific probability of 1 in 100 quintillion. The 24-year game of hide-and-seek was officially, irrevocably over. The blinding, sterile fluorescent lights of the State Crime Laboratory in Columbus seemed to hum with an electric, almost unbearable intensity as the final, absolute confirmation flashed across the primary sequencer's digital display, forever sealing the fate of a man who had successfully outrun his own shadow for 2.5 decades. The statistical probability, 1 in 100 quintillion, was not merely a mathematical abstraction or a theoretical legal argument. It was an immutable, biological truth inscribed in the very fabric of human DNA, an irrefutable signature that stripped away 24 years of calculated lies in a fraction of a millisecond. When the lead forensic geneticist picked up the encrypted landline to dial the direct extension of the Stark County Cold Case Task Force commander, the ensuing conversation was remarkably brief, devoid of dramatic fanfare or celebratory cheers, characterized instead by the heavy, suffocating silence of seasoned law enforcement professionals processing the sheer, unfathomable magnitude of the betrayal they were about to expose. The scientific hunt had officially concluded. The microscopic ghosts of 2002 had finally spoken their indisputable truth, and the investigation immediately violently pivoted from a theoretical genetic inquiry into a high-stakes, tactical hunt for a predator who is currently sleeping soundly in a comfortable suburban bed less than 15 miles from the very precinct where his victim's file had gathered dust for a quarter of a century. Inside the heavily secured, windowless briefing room of the Stark County Sheriff's Department, the atmosphere was thick with a toxic mixture of profound vindication and absolute, sickening horror. Detectives who had spent years staring at the gruesome crime scene photographs of 34-year-old Sarah Linwood, memorizing the ligature marks on her throat, the defensive bruising on her forearms, and the agonizing terror frozen in her final expression, now found themselves staring at a blown-up, high-resolution surveillance photograph of the killer's face, captured just 48 hours prior as he casually ordered a coffee at a local drive-thru window. The psychological weight of the revelation was entirely staggering, fundamentally breaking the established paradigms of how the detectives had profiled the phantom suspect over the years. They were not looking at a hardened, transient drifter, nor a known, violent parolee with a rap sheet of prior offenses. They were looking at a pillar of the surviving family's support system, a man who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Sarah's devastated children at the gravesite under the dreary autumn rain of 2002, a man who had likely shared Thanksgiving dinners, attended high school graduations, and offered comforting hugs to the very orphans he had ruthlessly created. To fathom the sheer, sociopathic endurance required to maintain such an impenetrable facade of grief and innocence for 24 continuous years, To look into the weeping eyes of a motherless child and offer hollow consolations while knowing you were the architect of their eternal nightmare sent a visceral shudder down the spines of even the most hardened homicide veterans in the room. The legal machinery required to shatter this meticulously constructed 24-year illusion began to turn with a terrifying, unstoppable velocity. By the time the sun dipped below the Ohio horizon on that pivotal Tuesday evening, casting long, dark shadows across the county courthouse, the lead prosecutor and the task force commander were sequestered inside the district attorney's private chambers, meticulously drafting the most critical arrest warrant in the modern history of the jurisdiction. Every single paragraph of the 50-page probable cause affidavit was heavily scrutinized. Every chain of custody log for the frozen 2002 fingernail scrapings was reviewed with a microscopic lens, and the complex, labyrinthine methodology of the genetic genealogy trace was translated into precise, ironclad legal terminology designed to withstand the inevitable onslaught of aggressive defense attorneys. There was absolutely no room for procedural error, no margin for a clerical mistake that could potentially grant a technical loophole to a monster who had already stolen 2.5 decades of freedom. At precisely 11:45 p.m., a grim-faced Superior Court judge, summoned from his home under the veil of absolute operational secrecy, reviewed the exhaustive document in the quiet solitude of his office, picked up his heavy fountain pen, and signed his name to the bottom of the warrant, officially authorizing the immediate, forceful apprehension of the suspect for the charge of murder in the first degree. The ink drying on that single piece of legal paper represented the culmination of thousands of hours of desperate police work, the answer to millions of desperate prayers, and the incoming destruction of a family that was about to be traumatized all over again. In the pre-dawn hours of a crisp, freezing Wednesday morning, long before the suburban sprawl of Stark County began to stir, a convoy of unmarked, black tactical vehicles slipped silently out of the subterranean garage of the sheriff's department, moving like shadows through the deserted, amber-lit streets. Inside the lead-armored transport, the members of the regional SWAT team sat in absolute, disciplined silence, their faces illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of their tactical communication screens displaying the architectural blueprints of the target residence. They were operating under a strictly enforced media blackout, terrified that a leaked scanner transmission or a careless piece of neighborhood gossip might tip off a suspect who had demonstrated an uncanny ability to evade detection, potentially triggering a violent standoff or a desperate attempt at flight. The stakes were exponentially magnified by the fact that the suspect was not a desperate fugitive hiding in a fortified compound, but an aging, seemingly ordinary citizen living in a quiet, well-manicured suburban subdivision, entirely surrounded by innocent, sleeping neighbors who had absolutely no idea that a convicted in-waiting killer had been mowing his lawn and waving from his driveway for years. As the heavy, reinforced tires of the tactical vehicles rolled silently onto the freshly paved asphalt of the suspect's quiet cul-de-sac, the convoy cut their headlights, plunging the street into a tense, breathless darkness, the only sound being the synchronized, metallic clicks of automatic weapons being switched off their safeties. The takedown was executed with a sudden, overwhelming, and merciless precision designed to completely paralyze the suspect's cognitive ability to react, resist, or destroy any potential evidence. At exactly 5:32 a.m., the heavy steel ram of the entry team violently shattered the front door of the residence, the concussive boom echoing like a cannon shot through the sleeping neighborhood, instantly tearing the quiet suburban facade to absolute shreds. Tactical operators flooded into the darkened hallway, their high-intensity weapon lights cutting through the darkness, their voices roaring authoritative commands that left no room for hesitation. The suspect, jolted from a deep sleep, stumbled out of his master bedroom in a state of bewildered, groggy panic, entirely unprepared for the sheer velocity of the violence crashing down upon his sanctuary. Before he could process the blinding lights, before his brain could formulate a single lie or excuse, he was driven hard into the carpeted floor of his own hallway, his arms violently wrenched behind his back, and the cold, unyielding steel of heavy-duty handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists with a sharp, final click that signaled the absolute end of his 24-year charade. In that fleeting, Chaotic moment on the floor, surrounded by heavily armed strangers and the screaming commands of law enforcement. The realization must have washed over him like a freezing tidal wave. They knew. The invisible, microscopic ghost of Sarah Linwood, a woman he thought he had silenced forever in the damp fog of 2002, had finally reached out from the darkness of the grave and dragged him directly into the unforgiving light of justice. As the sun broke over the horizon, casting a harsh, pale morning light across the manicured lawns and frost-covered rooftops of the stunned suburban neighborhood, the quiet cul-de-sac had been completely transformed into a chaotic, swarming command post of flashing red and blue strobes, yellow crime scene tape, and bustling federal agents executing search warrants on every square inch of the property. Sleepy, bewildered neighbors stood in their driveways clutching their morning coffee mugs, their faces pale with shock as they watched the elderly, seemingly gentle man they had known for years being frog-marched out of his front door by a phalanx of heavily armed SWAT officers, his head bowed, his face shielded from the blinding glare of the early morning sun. The absolute cognitive dissonance of watching a neighborhood fixture, a man who had organized block parties and handed out Halloween candy, being loaded into the back of an armored transport vehicle on a first-degree murder charge, was a psychological blow that left the street in a state of paralyzed disbelief. But for the cold case detectives watching the heavy steel doors of the transport van slam shut, locking the phantom of 2002 securely in the darkness where he belonged, there was no disbelief, only a profound, exhausted sense of finality. The relentless, agonizing marathon was over. The DNA had spoken its absolute truth, and the most devastating chapter in Stark County history was about to be ripped open on the public stage, setting the scene for an explosive legal reckoning that would permanently alter the lives of everyone involved. The breaking news banner flashed across local television screens in bold, electric red lettering, instantly preempting morning broadcasts across the state of Ohio. Arrest made in 2002 Stark County cold case. Family member in custody for strangulation of Sarah Linwood, and 24-year mystery solved by advanced genetic DNA. Within minutes of the press conference announcement held outside the county courthouse, a tidal wave of sheer, unadulterated shock reverberated through every corner of the community. People stopped dead in their tracks in grocery store aisles, office break rooms, and commuting vehicles as the identity of the arrested man echoed through speakers and digital feeds. For 24 long years, the citizens of Stark County had operated under the terrifying assumption that a calculating, anonymous monster had crept out of the shadows, claimed an innocent life, and vanished into the ether. To learn that the killer had not been a roaming phantom, but a trusted member of Sarah Linwood's inner circle, a man who had walked among her grieving children, eaten at her family's holiday tables, and offered quiet words of comfort at her memorial service, was a psychological blow that shattered the very foundation of the community's collective trust. Inside the sheriff's department headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense as news crews from across the nation set up a forest of satellite trucks, long-range cameras, and broadcast lights outside the high-security perimeter. Behind the reinforced glass doors of the interrogation wing, the suspect sat motionless in a cold, windowless room, wrapped in a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed at the waist and secured to an anchor bolt embedded deep in the concrete floor. Across the heavy metal table sat the lead cold case detective and a veteran state investigator, their thick leather-bound files laid out between them like a roadmap of a 24-year lie. The initial air of defiant confidence that the suspect had maintained during his sudden arrest had completely evaporated, replaced by a hollow, terrified stillness as he realized the absolute, unyielding nature of the biological trap that had finally sprung around him. There were no vague witness statements to dissect, no eyewitness credibility to attack, and no procedural technicalities to hide behind. There was only his genetic signature, extracted from beneath the fingernails of his victim, matching his living cells with an undeniable certainty of 1 in 100 quintillion. For Sarah Linwood's now adult children, the sudden phone call from the lead prosecutor in the early hours of that morning had delivered a visceral shock that felt like a secondary, devastating explosion ripping through their lives. The emotional scars that had slowly scabbed over across 2 decades were violently torn open in a single, breathless sentence. They had spent their entire youth praying for justice, holding annual candlelight vigils, and begging the public for any scrap of information that might identify their mother's killer. But nothing in their worst, most vivid nightmares had prepared them for the soul-crushing reality of who that killer actually was. The realization that the very person who had held their hands during their mother's funeral, who had asked about their school progress, and who had sat across from them during decades of family gatherings was the same individual who had brutally choked the life out of Sarah inside that foggy, idling sedan was an excruciating betrayal that threatened to unravel their entire sense of reality. The past 24 years of their lives felt instantly retroactively poisoned, transformed into a twisted, sociopathic theater where every memory was tainted by the quiet, mocking presence of a murderer in plain sight. Outside the county jail, local and national press outlets went into an absolute frenzy, churning out constant updates, expert panels, and investigative deep dives into the revolutionary technology that had finally cracked the case. Headlines across digital media platforms proclaimed, "The Phantom Among Us. How Genetic Geology Unmasked a Family Monster, 24 Years of Betrayal in Stark County, and the Microscopic Trace That Dragged a Cold Case Killer to Justice." Legal analysts dominated late-night news cycles, dissecting the unprecedented power of consumer DNA databases combined with high-throughput genomic sequencing, warning that the resolution of the Linwood case was merely the opening salvo in a nationwide reckoning for historical violent offenders who believed time had granted them immunity. Across the country, thousands of cold case files were suddenly being pulled from subterranean storage, re-examined through the lens of this terrifyingly precise forensic revolution. As the sun began to set on that historic day, casting long, crimson streaks across the sky above Stark County, the cold reality of the upcoming judicial battle began to take shape. The arrest was an undisputed, historic triumph for modern science and law enforcement, but it was also the beginning of an agonizing, emotionally hazardous trial process that would force a shattered family to stand in open court and confront a monster from their own bloodline. The Phantom of 2002 had finally been given a name, a face, and steel handcuffs, but the path to ultimate, formal justice would require laying bare every single detail of a dark, twisted secret that had remained buried in the damp Ohio fog for nearly a quarter of a century. The community watched with bated breath as the legal machinery geared up for a high-stakes courtroom confrontation that promised to test the limits of human resilience, legal strategy, and emotional endurance. The heavy wooden doors of the Stark County Common Pleas courtroom swung open with a resounding, echoes-filled thud that resonated down the marble corridors, signaling the official commencement of the preliminary hearing for the state of Ohio versus the killer of Sarah Linwood. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity, filled with veteran crime reporters, local residents who had carried the psychological weight of the unsolved murder for 24 years, and a heavily guarded row dedicated exclusively to Sarah's surviving children and immediate family. The air inside the courtroom was thick with an agonizing, palpable tension as the defendant, stripped of his quiet suburban attire and now clad in a bright orange county jail jumpsuit, was led into the room by 3 armed sheriff's deputies, his wrists and ankles secured by clanking restraint chains. For the first time in nearly a quarter of a century, the man who had operated as a silent phantom in the shadows was forced to sit in the harsh, unflattering glare of full public accountability, unable to look his own grieving relatives in the eye as he took his seat at the defense table. The lead prosecutor stood before the judge's bench with a calm, methodical demeanor that contrasted sharply with the high-stakes drama filling the room. Opening the state's preliminary presentation, she laid out the chronological architecture of a tragedy that had begun on that damp, foggy October night in 2002. She didn't rely on theatrical sensationalism. Instead, she systematically erected a mountain of irrefutable scientific facts, starting with the 43-second payphone call made from the highway gas station and culminating in the ultra-high-density genomic sequencing conducted in early 2026. The prosecutor detailed how single nucleotide polymorphism mapping had bridged the gap between microscopic skin cells preserved beneath Sarah's fingernails for 24 years and the living biological profile of the man sitting just 20 feet away. As the complex technical data was presented on large courtroom displays, showing the clear, overlapping genetic markers that proved a 1 in 100 quintillion match, a quiet, collective gasp rippled through the spectators, solidifying the realization that modern molecular science had effectively stripped the killer of any remaining pretense of innocence. Defense attorneys, aware of the sheer, overwhelming weight of the physical evidence, immediately initiated an aggressive legal counteroffensive aimed at questioning the handling and preservation of the biological samples over the multi-decade period. They cross-examined the state crime lab's evidence custodians, raising sharp questions regarding potential sample degradation, cross-contamination risks within the subterranean storage vaults of the early 2000s, and the novel algorithms used by private genetic genealogy databases. They argued passionately that transferring biological evidence between local, state, and federal facilities across 24 years created inherent vulnerabilities in the chain of custody that should render the TouchDNA profile inadmissible. However, the prosecution was meticulously prepared, calling upon senior forensic directors who produced decades of pristine, uninterrupted temperature log records, tamper-evident evidence seal documentation, and rigorous validation studies demonstrating the absolute reliability of modern high-throughput sequencing even on degraded historical samples. For Sarah Linwood's children, sitting in the front row just feet behind the prosecution table, listening to the granular, forensic details of their mother's final agonizing moments was an emotional ordeal that pushed them to the absolute brink of human endurance. They watched as digital enhancements of the 2002 crime scene were brought up on screen, the metallic gray sedan idling on the soft shoulder of the gravel road, the cold mist clinging to the windows, and the dark, bruised impression left upon her throat by a ruthless hand. The emotional weight of sitting in the same room with the family member who had inflicted this unthinkable violence, a man who had attended family dinners and hugged them during their childhood grief, was an excruciating paradox that shattered whatever remaining illusions they had maintained about human trust. Yet, despite the visible tears streaming down their faces, they remained stoic, refusing to break, holding hands tightly as they bore silent, dignified witness to the truth that was finally triumphing over decades of calculated lies. As the multi-day preliminary hearing drew to a close, the presiding judge took a lengthy pause, reviewing the mountain of physical exhibits, forensic testimonies, and genetic genealogy reports submitted into evidence by the state. When he finally addressed the quiet courtroom, his voice echoed with heavy authority. Denying every defense motion to suppress the DNA evidence or reduce the astronomical bond, the judge declared that the prosecution had established an overwhelming, ironclad case of probable cause. He officially bound the defendant over for full trial on charges of aggravated murder in the first degree, setting the stage for a landmark judicial trial that would serve as a global benchmark for the power of investigative genetic genealogy. As the deputies stepped forward to escort the defendant back to his isolation cell, the killer turned slightly, his eyes briefly sweeping across the gallery, catching the unflinching, resolute stares of Sarah's adult children, a moment that signaled the definitive collapse of his 24-year charade and the unstoppable approach of final justice. The spring of 2026 brought a sharp, abrasive clarity to Stark County, Ohio, as the formal trial for the aggravated murder of Sarah Linwood officially opened inside the packed main courtroom of the county courthouse. The trial was no longer merely a local legal proceeding. It had become an international focal point for forensic science, criminal jurisprudence, and the terrifying, sociopathic depths of human betrayal. Outside the granite steps of the building, television news crews from major global networks maintained continuous live feeds, broadcasting real-time updates under screaming headlines: Stark County Trial of the Century, Genetic Genealogy on Trial, 24 Years of Deceit Unraveled, and Justice for Sarah Linwood in an Ohio courtroom. Inside, every single seat in the gallery was claimed hours before the morning session began, with court spectators and legal scholars sitting shoulder to shoulder, waiting in tense, breathless silence for the prosecution to break down the final defenses of a man who had successfully evaded justice for nearly a quarter of a century. Taking center stage before the jury, the lead prosecutor delivered an opening statement that was both a masterclass in forensic precision and a devastating emotional narrative. She did not raise her voice to an angry shout. Instead, she spoke with a quiet, authoritative gravity that held the 14 jurors in absolute thrall. Point by point, she walked the jury back to that damp, foggy October night in 2002, reconstructing the precise timeline of Sarah's final hours. She detailed the mysterious 43-second payphone call originating from the highway gas station, the victim's sudden and confident departure from her home without her purse or wallet, and her peaceful arrival at the isolated gravel access road. Sarah Linwood did not walk to her death driven by fear, the prosecutor declared, pointing a steady, unyielding finger toward the defense table. She drove to that dark wood line because she believed she was meeting someone who cared for her, someone who belonged to her world, someone she trusted implicitly. And in return for that complete, unsuspecting trust, she was met with cold, methodical, lethal force. The prosecution then called its key scientific experts, initiating a relentless, multi-day masterclass in modern molecular genetics that systematically dismantled every defense strategy. State forensic geneticists took the stand with complex digital displays, explaining to the jury how advanced single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP, sequencing had transformed microscopic, degraded skin cells recovered from beneath Sarah's fingernails into a clear, digital roadmap of human identity. They walked the jury through the mathematical impossibility of a false match, demonstrating that the biological profile extracted from the 2002 freezer swab matched the defendant's freshly acquired reference DNA with a probability exceeding 1 in 100 quintillion. When defense attorneys attempted to suggest that the skin cells could have been transferred casually during routine family contact days prior to the murder, the state's chief medical examiner delivered a decisive, catastrophic blow. The biological material recovered from beneath the victim's nails was deeply embedded alongside defensive tissue abrasions, proving conclusively that it was deposited during a violent, desperate struggle for life as Sarah fought against her strangler inside the cramped car cabin. The true emotional climax of the prosecution's case came when Sarah's 2 adult children took the witness stand to deliver their long-awaited testimonies. Sitting directly across from the man who had robbed them of their mother when they were just young children, they spoke with an extraordinary, dignified composure that brought several members of the jury to visible tears. They recounted the harrowing 24-year nightmare of growing up in an empty home, haunted by unanswered questions and perpetual fear. But more agonizingly, they described the surreal, nightmare reality of the post, 2002 years, recalling how the defendant had sat at their family dining table during holidays, offered comforting words during anniversaries, and watched them weep at their mother's grave, all while carrying the absolute, chilling knowledge of his own guilt. Their testimony laid bare the profound, sociopathic cruelty required to maintain such an impenetrable facade of familial warmth while hiding the darkest secret in county history. When the state finally rested its case, the defense mounted a desperate, brief effort to construct reasonable doubt, leaning heavily on arguments of potential evidence contamination during the long storage period between 2002 and 2026. However, under sharp cross-examination, their expert witnesses were forced to admit that no known environmental contamination or storage failure could magically alter a stranger's DNA into a perfect 600,000 marker match for a specific family member. The defense chose not to put the defendant on the stand, knowing that his arrogant facade would crumble under the prosecutor's merciless interrogation regarding his movements on the night of October 2002. As closing arguments concluded and the judge delivered his final instructions, the 14 jurors filed out of the courtroom to begin their deliberations, leaving behind an atmosphere of agonizing, electrifying suspense that gripped the entire state of Ohio, waiting for the final, thunderous blow of justice to land. The heavy oak doors of the jury room remained firmly shut for 3 nerve-wracking days as the 14 citizens of Stark County methodically weighed 24 years of evidence, forensic testimony, and genetic sequencing. Outside, in the crowded marble corridors, the air was thick with static tension. Journalists, legal observers, and local residents paced back and forth under the dim lights, while Sarah Linwood's adult children sat quietly on a wooden bench, holding hands in absolute, resolute silence. Every time a footstep echoed near the deliberation room door, a collective gasp ran through the hallway. The wait was agonizing, but it carried the heavy weight of inevitable truth. After nearly a quarter of a century of silence, false leads, and deep-seated paranoia, the entire community stood on the precipice of a definitive, historical verdict that would echo through the annals of American criminal justice. On the morning of the fourth day, a sharp, double knock sounded from inside the jury room, sending an electric shock through the entire courthouse. The announcement spread like wildfire across digital news feeds and broadcast networks. Verdict reached in Stark County cold case trial. Jury returns after 22 hours of deliberation and final reckoning for 2002 strangler of Sarah Linwood. Within 20 minutes, the main courtroom was packed to maximum capacity, with spectators spilling over into overflow rooms equipped with closed-circuit monitors. The defendant was led into the room by 4 armed deputies, his face completely devoid of color, his shoulders hunched forward under the harsh glare of court lights. He sat at the defense table with his eyes glued to the polished mahogany surface, utterly refusing to glance at the front row where Sarah's children sat with upright, dignified postures, ready to face whatever answer the scales of justice produced. The judge took his place at the bench, his expression grave and unreadable, and requested the jury foreman to present the official verdict forms. The quiet inside the courtroom was absolute, so intense that the faint rustle of the court clerk's paper sounded like a crack of thunder. As the foreman stood up and cleared his throat, he looked directly into the eyes of the defendant and read the words that had taken 24 long years to arrive. On the sole count of aggravated murder in the first degree, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. A sudden, sharp intake of breath swept through the gallery, followed immediately by quiet, muffled sobs of profound relief from Sarah's family. The defendant did not move, nor did he offer a single visible reaction. He remained frozen in his seat like a hollow shell, as if the reality of his eternal condemnation had instantly crushed whatever remaining illusions of freedom he had harbored. During the immediate sentencing phase that followed, the courtroom transitioned into an emotional furnace as Sarah's adult children delivered their formal victim impact statements directly to the convicted killer. Standing at the podium just feet from the man who had torn their world apart, her daughter spoke with a powerful, crystal-clear voice that resonated through every corner of the room. For 24 years, you walked among us like a benefactor, attending our family celebrations, hugging us when we cried, and watching us bleed over a mother we lost, she said, her eyes fixed on the back of his bowed head. You thought time was your shield. You thought the Darkwood line in 2002 had swallowed your crime forever. But you forgot one thing. Truth does not decay. You stole our mother's future, but you could never steal her light. And today, that light has burned your lies to absolute ash. The judge did not show an ounce of mercy when issuing his final, binding decree. Denying any possibility of future parole, he sentenced the 71-year-old killer to life imprisonment without the possibility of release, ensuring that his remaining days on Earth would be spent entirely within the cold, concrete confines of a maximum security state penitentiary. As the heavy steel handcuffs were clicked around the murderer's wrists for the final time and deputies led him away toward the holding cell elevator, a profound sense of closure settled over the courtroom like a warm, comforting blanket. The long, dark nightmare that had begun on a foggy October morning in 2002 had finally reached its absolute, definitive end. The phantom had been stripped of his disguise. The microscopic evidence had triumphed over decades of calculated deceit, and the memory of Sarah Linwood was restored to the light of justice, forever untainted by the shadow of an unsolved horror. The metallic clang of the heavy iron door echoing down the isolation block of the state correctional facility marked the official start of a lifetime in absolute darkness for the 71-year-old inmate, now designated by a state identification number rather than a family name. Outside those towering reinforced concrete walls, Wrapped in layers of razor wire and monitored by high-definition perimeter security grids, the world of 2026 moved forward with its relentless, vibrant momentum. But inside the 9 by 12-foot cell, time had completely collapsed. The meticulously maintained 30-year illusion, built upon suburban respectability, quiet weekend routines, and an arrogant psychological belief that the passage of decades guaranteed permanent immunity, had been utterly obliterated by the unyielding precision of modern molecular science. Every single second of his remaining life would now be spent staring at cold, painted cinder blocks, listening to the synchronized footfalls of guards patrolling the tier, and living in an unending, psychological prison where he was forced to relive the exact moment a handful of microscopic skin cells transferred onto Sarah Linwood's clothing on an autumn night in 2002 was dragged out of a deep-freeze locker to seal his eternal doom. There were no further appeals that could rewrite genetic sequencing, no statute of limitations that could erase a biological signature, and no amount of denial that could shield a coward from the blinding light of total accountability. Far away from the oppressive, sterile gloom of the maximum security prison blocks, the quiet suburban streets of Stark County, Ohio, began to heal under the warm, gentle light of a late spring afternoon. On the edge of the quiet woodline off the gravel access road, where an idling sedan had once stood as a symbol of terror and unsolved horror, a small, elegant memorial stone now sat embedded among wildflowers. Carved into the polished dark granite was Sarah Linwood's name, her birth and death dates, and a simple, poetic inscription: "The light of truth pierces every shadow." Local residents walking along the nearby trail often paused at the site, leaving fresh flowers or taking moments of quiet reflection. The suffocating paranoia that had hung over the town for nearly 24 years, the toxic dread of wondering if a killer lived next door or walked the aisles of the local market, had finally dissolved into a deep, lasting sense of peace. The community was no longer defined by the mystery of an unsolved Midwestern crime, but by the extraordinary resilience of a town that refused to let a victim be forgotten. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the conclusion of the trial offered a profound emotional liberation that allowed them to finally step out from under the long, cold shadow of 2002. They no longer had to look at family photographs with a sense of retroactive betrayal or wonder if the comforting words offered at past gatherings were spoken by the very hands that took their mother's life. The toxic weight of unanswered questions had been permanently lifted, replaced by the warm, untainted memory of a loving 34-year-old mother whose spirit had guided the pursuit of justice across 2 decades. In late May, they gathered with close friends and supportive community members to establish a charitable foundation in Sarah's name, dedicated to supporting cold case task forces, funding advanced forensic testing for low-income jurisdictions, and advocating for victims of cold case homicides across the nation. Through their strength, Sarah's legacy was transformed from a tragic headline into an enduring beacon of hope for thousands of families still waiting in the dark for their own day of justice. Deep within the subterranean archives of the Stark County Sheriff's Department, the physical case file designated number 02, CR 8819 rested securely inside its steel cabinet, its final sign-off stamped in bold, permanent crimson ink, solved by investigative genetic genealogy, closed by conviction. Yet, this file did not mark an end to the department's operational momentum, but rather stood as the founding cornerstone of a newly expanded, state-of-the-art forensic cold case unit. The unprecedented success of the Linwood investigation served as a national blueprint for law enforcement agencies across the country. Detectives and genetic analysts from across the United States routinely contacted the Stark County team, seeking tactical strategies, evidentiary chain of custody protocols, and algorithmic guidance for integrating low-template touch DNA with public genealogy registries. The methodical workflow that had unmasked a 24-year phantom proved conclusively that no historical violent crime is ever truly cold as long as physical evidence remains preserved, sending a terrifying message to violent offenders everywhere that time can no longer offer them shelter. As the sun set over the quiet Midwestern horizon, casting a golden, peaceful glow across the suburban neighborhoods, rural backroads, and bustling town centers of Stark County, the extraordinary saga of Sarah Linwood reached its final, immortal resting place. It stood as a monument to human resilience, a testament to the unwavering courage of children who never stopped fighting, the dedication of homicide detectives who refused to close a dusty folder, and the miraculous evolution of modern science that turned invisible cells into an unyielding voice for the dead. The gavel had fallen, the courtroom lights had dimmed, and the killer remained locked away in a cell where he could never again harm the innocent. The ultimate victory belonged not to the passage of years or the darkness of deceit, but to the eternal persistence of truth, proving to all the world that justice, no matter how long delayed, will always cut through the deepest fog to shine its absolute light upon the innocent. The definitive, permanent closure of Case File 02, CR 8819 marked far more than the conclusion of a singular criminal proceeding in Stark County. It triggered a profound, systemic paradigm shift across the entire regional legal and law enforcement infrastructure. Inside the state prosecutor's office, a dedicated post-conviction review committee was formally established, tasked with systematically re-evaluating every active and dormant cold case within the district's jurisdiction using the exact forensic blueprint perfected during the Sarah Linwood investigation. The legal precedent set during the high-stakes pretrial motions, where defense challenges regarding the chain of custody for multi-decade biological storage and the validity of public genetic genealogy databases were utterly dismantled, became required reading at law schools and state police academies nationwide. Law enforcement agencies from across the country sent specialized investigative teams to Stark County to study how detectives had successfully bridged the gap between complex molecular sequencing and courtroom-ready probable cause. What had begun 24 years earlier as a horrifying, foggy night on an isolated access road had ultimately evolved into an immortal, gold-standard benchmark for modern criminal justice. Meanwhile, inside the maximum security tier of the state penitentiary, the psychological weight of absolute isolation continued its silent, relentless erosion of the 71-year-old convict's existence. Stripped of his former social standing, his suburban home, and the carefully crafted persona of a grieving, supportive family member, his world was now reduced to a rigid, sterile routine governed by loud steel bells, fluorescent lights that never fully dimmed, and the unyielding authority of prison guards. In the prison yard, where younger inmates moved in tight, watchful groups, he remained a solitary, hollow figure, shunned even within the criminal subculture due to the extraordinary, sociopathic nature of his crime and his decades-long betrayal of his own flesh and blood. The arrogant conviction that he had outsmarted the system on that damp October night in 2002 had transformed into an inescapable mental prison, where every ticking second served as an agonizing reminder that a handful of microscopic skin cells had dismantled his 30-year charade and ensured he would die behind iron bars, completely forgotten by the world outside. In stark contrast to the dreary gloom of the correctional facility, the suburban neighborhood of Stark County, where Sarah Linwood had once raised her children, experienced a quiet, beautiful renaissance of spirit and community cohesion. The lingering, invisible pall of paranoia that had caused neighbors to lock their doors, cast suspicious glances across manicured lawns, and fear the shadows along rural backroads was forever lifted. The annual memorial gathering at the Granite Stone near the Woodline transformed from a somber, grief-stricken vigil into a vibrant celebration of life, resilience, and the triumph of truth. Local high school students competing for the newly created Sarah Linwood Memorial Scholarship submitted essays on bioethics, criminal justice reform, and community safety, ensuring that her name became synonymous not with a senseless act of violence, but with empowering future generations to protect the vulnerable and seek justice for the silenced. For Sarah's adult children, the passage of months following the trial brought a deep, healing tranquility that had eluded them for nearly a quarter of a century. They spent their first summer free from the suffocating anxiety of unanswered questions, taking their own young children to the very parks and lakes Sarah had loved, filling their lives with new, joyful memories untainted by the ghost of an unsolved mystery. The family foundation flourished, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars to fund advanced touch DNA extraction kits and forensic genealogy processing for impoverished rural police departments that lacked the financial resources to pursue their own cold cases. Standing before a national convention of crime victims advocates in late 2026, Sarah's daughter delivered an inspiring keynote address, reminding thousands of grieving families that no matter how many years pass, no matter how deep the betrayal, and no matter how dark the road appears, science and human determination have combined to ensure that no killer can ever truly outrun the light of justice. As autumn returned to Ohio once again, turning the leaves along the Stark County woodlines into vibrant shades of crimson and gold, the quiet access road, where a tragic journey had begun 24 years earlier, lay bathed in warm, tranquil sunlight. The damp fog of October 2002 was gone forever, replaced by an enduring, crystal-clear peace that enveloped the entire community. Case File 02, CR 8819 sat quietly in the archives, a thick, bound testament to human persistence, scientific genius, and the unyielding bond of familial love that refused to surrender to time. Sarah Linwood was finally at peace, her memory vindicated, her killer locked away forever, and her story permanently etched into history as an unyielding beacon of hope for every cold case waiting in the dark to be solved. The ripple effect of the Sarah Linwood verdict extended far beyond the borders of Ohio, igniting a sweeping legislative movement that resonated across state capitals nationwide. Dubbed Sarah's Law by advocacy groups and bipartisan lawmakers, new legislation was introduced to allocate mandatory state funding toward the forensic retesting of cold case physical evidence using advanced touch DNA and investigative genetic genealogy techniques. State crime laboratories were provided with modern high-throughput genomic sequencers, and specialized cold case units were established in every major municipal police department across the region. Legislators stood alongside Sarah's adult children on the steps of the state capitol as the governor signed the bill into law, solidifying a permanent institutional safeguard designed to ensure that no murder victim's file would ever again be allowed to quietly accumulate dust in a subterranean vault. The resolution of a single 24-year mystery had effectively catalyzed a sweeping transformation in how American law enforcement addresses historical violent crime. Inside the state correctional facility, the reality of the newly enacted forensic standards reached the convict through the small, crackling television set mounted in the common day room. He sat in his standard-issue plastic chair, watching news broadcasts highlight the new forensic task forces being deployed to investigate unsolved homicides from the late 20th century. His name was repeatedly invoked by legal analysts as the primary case study, the definitive warning to historical offenders who believed the passage of time had granted them permanent immunity. The irony was suffocatingly complete. The very case he had spent 24 years attempting to conceal had become the national catalyst for unmasking dozens of other violent offenders who had hidden in plain sight. Every headline, every news special, and every legislative announcement served as a psychological hammer blow, stripping away his last remaining delusion of control and reinforcing the absolute, unyielding nature of his lifetime sentence. At the Regional Crime Laboratory in Columbus, the forensic team that had extracted the microscopic profile from beneath Sarah Linwood's fingernails expanded its investigative genetic genealogy division. The specialized workspace, once considered an experimental pilot program, was now a bustling hub of high-tech molecular biology. Rows of state-of-the-art sequencers worked continuously around the clock, processing degraded biological samples from cold cases dating back to the late 1970s. The walls of the facility were lined with case boards featuring historical photographs, evidence logs, and family trees, each representing an unsolved murder waiting for a breakthrough. For the scientists and forensic geneticists who had worked tirelessly to crack Case File 02, CR 8819, Sarah Linwood's case remained their primary touchstone, a living proof of concept that no matter how minute or degraded a biological sample might be, modern science possessed the power to give a voice to the silent and deliver long-delayed justice to grieving families. Back in Stark County, the local community continued to embrace its redefined narrative, moving entirely past the lingering trauma of the 2002 investigation. The local sheriff's department hosted an annual regional training seminar on advanced cold case management, drawing investigators, prosecutors, and forensic experts from across the Midwest. The gravel access road off the main highway, once synonymous with terror and murder, had been transformed into a peaceful county nature preserve, featuring walking paths, tree-lined benches, and educational signs about local wildlife. The small granite memorial stone dedicated to Sarah Linwood sat nestled among flowering native plants near the entrance, serving not as a reminder of a dark tragedy, but as a permanent symbol of community strength, scientific truth, and the unyielding persistence of familial love. For Sarah's children, the ongoing impact of their mother's legacy provided a deep, enduring sense of purpose and healing. Their work with the Sarah Linwood Foundation allowed them to travel across the country, meeting with other families of cold case victims, offering guidance on navigating the legal system, and providing financial grants for specialized DNA testing. They watched with immense pride as former cold case files in other states were solved using the exact methods pioneered in their mother's case, knowing that each newly unmasked killer and each resolved case was a direct continuation of Sarah's victory over the dark. The nightmare that had begun on a foggy October morning in 2002 had come full circle, transforming an act of unfathomable betrayal into an immortal legacy of justice, truth, and hope that would continue to illuminate the dark for generations to come. As summer faded into the early golden tones of autumn 2026, the legislative momentum sparked by Sarah's Law catalyzed an unprecedented wave of forensic reevaluations across municipal police departments throughout the Midwest. In city after city, cold case vaults that had remained locked for 3, 4, or even 5 decades were unsealed by newly trained specialized units. Dusty cardboard archive boxes containing weathered paper files, faded 35mm crime scene photographs, and glass vials of preserved biological material were brought up into the modern light of high-throughput genomic sequencing laboratories. The scientific methodology that had brought an end to the 24-year nightmare in Stark County was no longer viewed as an experimental, high-stakes novelty reserved for extraordinary circumstances. It had officially become the baseline standard for cold case homicide investigations across North America. Inside these modern forensic facilities, teams of young molecular biologists and forensic geneticists worked side by side with veteran homicide detectives, creating a powerful fusion of traditional investigative grit and cutting-edge genomic technology. Every week, new single nucleotide polymorphism profiles were generated from microsamples of degraded DNA, uploaded into public investigative databases, and converted into detailed, multi-generational family trees. Case after case that had sat dormant since the 1970s and 1980s began to yield long-awaited answers. Across Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania, news broadcasts regularly featured live press conferences where gray-haired police chiefs stood beside tear-streaked families to announce long-delayed arrests in decades-old cold cases. The common denominator in almost every single announcement was the clear, unwavering technical reference to the procedural blueprint established during the prosecution of Sarah Linwood's killer. Meanwhile, within the concrete walls of the state correctional facility, the reality of this nationwide forensic reckoning echoed continuously through the common rooms and cell tiers. For the 71-year-old inmate serving life without parole, every television news broadcast highlighting a newly cracked cold case served as an agonizing reminder of his own permanent downfall. The arrogance that had sustained him through 24 years of hiding in plain sight, the deep, sociopathic belief that he was smarter than the law, smarter than the detectives, and immune to the passage of time, had been utterly destroyed. He was no longer a respected member of a suburban community or a patriarch sitting at holiday tables. He was inmate 881 to 902, a man whose entire existence was defined by a biological footprint left beneath his victim's fingernails on a foggy night in 2002. In Stark County, the local police department's newly established Sarah Linwood Cold Case Center became an operational hub for interagency collaboration. Detectives who had spent their entire careers working in the shadow of unsolved homicides now hosted visiting task forces from across the country, sharing technical protocols, evidence preservation standards, and strategies for managing the complex ethical considerations inherent in genetic genealogy work. The atmosphere within the department had fundamentally shifted from one of lingering frustration to one of intense, proactive determination. Officers no longer looked at historical case files as tragic, impossible dead ends, but as active puzzles waiting for the right scientific key to unlock the truth. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, watching their mother's name become synonymous with a national movement for justice provided a deep, restorative solace that smoothed over the sharpest edges of their lifelong grief. They regularly visited the peaceful nature preserve off the gravel access road, sitting on the wooden bench beside the dark granite memorial stone surrounded by blooming native wildflowers. The woodline that had once represented an absolute horror, a place of dark fog, idling cars, and stolen lives, had been completely reclaimed by peace, light, and nature. They knew that while nothing could ever restore the decades of hugs, advice, and quiet moments they had lost with their mother, her spirit had achieved something extraordinary. She had become an unyielding beacon of light that was actively dragging thousands of hidden monsters out of the dark and delivering peace to countless other families across the nation. As the calendar turned toward the deep chill of late 2026, the sweeping national momentum sparked by the resolution of the Sarah Linwood case manifested in federal legislation known formally as the Advanced Forensic Genetics and Cold Case Accountability Act, though it was universally recognized by law enforcement and victims' advocacy groups across the United States as the federal codification of Sarah's Law. Convened in Washington, D.C., a bipartisan congressional committee formally commended the Stark County Sheriff's Department, the State Forensic Laboratory, and the tireless resilience of Sarah's children. During the televised congressional hearing, the lead state prosecutor presented a comprehensive, highly technical white paper detailing how investigative genetic genealogy, low-template touch DNA extraction, and rigorous multi-agency coordination had transformed a seemingly hopeless 24-year deadlock into an airtight, scientifically unassailable murder conviction. The document was immediately adopted by the Department of Justice as the official operational handbook for federal and state cold case task forces, institutionalizing the exact protocols that had unmasked a trusted family member hiding in plain sight. Inside federal and state law enforcement academies nationwide, the tactical blueprint of the Linwood investigation was integrated into mandatory core curricula for incoming homicide detectives and forensic investigators. Trainees were walked through every meticulous phase of the 2026 breakthrough, from the initial re-examination of the 2002 physical evidence lockers and the handling of degraded biological samples, to the complex ethical frameworks governing public genetic databases and the seamless presentation of probabilistic genotyping before a jury. Instructors emphasized that the most dangerous weapon in a violent criminal's arsenal was no longer cleverness or the absence of eyewitnesses, but the comforting illusion of elapsed time. The curriculum reinforced a chilling reality for modern offenders. Physical evidence preserved from decades past is no longer a dead end, but a ticking clock waiting for the relentless advancement of molecular science to catch up. Deep inside the maximum security state penitentiary, the inmate serving life without the possibility of parole found himself completely isolated from the expanding nationwide impact of his own downfall. Stripped of any remaining privacy, his daily existence was dictated by the harsh, metallic clanging of heavy steel doors, the monotonous rhythm of institutional guard patrols, and the inescapable claustrophobia of concrete walls. The news reports filtering through the common room television, showcasing federal funding grants, expanded state DNA databases, and dozens of historical cold cases being solved week after week, acted as a continuous, psychological trial. He was forced to confront the staggering futility of his 24-year deception. Not only had his meticulous, calculated cover-up failed entirely, but his crime had ultimately become the primary catalyst for exposing countless other hidden predators who shared his false sense of absolute impunity. In Stark County, The municipal community and the sheriff's department marked the approaching end of 2026 by hosting a commemorative regional symposium dedicated to the intersection of forensic science and community healing. Detectives, geneticists, legal scholars, and victim advocates from over 30 states gathered at the county courthouse to share technological advancements, discuss investigative best practices, and honor the families of historical homicide victims who refused to let their loved ones be forgotten. The annual gathering at the Granite Memorial Stone near the peaceful nature preserve drew hundreds of local residents, community leaders, and law enforcement officers who stood together in quiet solidarity. The once feared woodline off the gravel access road stood bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight, completely transformed from a site of dark mystery and hidden violence into an enduring symbol of communal strength, scientific triumph, and unyielding justice. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the closing months of 2026 brought a profound sense of ultimate closure and spiritual peace. The foundation bearing their mother's name had successfully funded advanced touch DNA processing kits for over 50 impoverished rural police departments nationwide, resulting in the reopening of dozens of dormant investigations and the identification of multiple unknown suspects. Standing together on the steps of the state capitol during the year's final foundation gala, Sarah's daughter looked out over a sea of supportive faces, grieving family members, and dedicated scientists. 24 years ago, darkness tried to consume our family and bury our mother's story in the fog of an unsolved Ohio mystery, she declared with a steady, resonant voice that captured the heart of a nation. They thought time was their ally. They thought silence was their shield. But they were wrong. Science gave her back her voice, truth dismantled every lie, and today, her light burns brighter than ever, a permanent, unyielding beacon ensuring that no family ever has to walk alone in the dark again. As 2026 drew to a close, the unprecedented momentum generated by the Sarah Linwood investigation ushered in a global transformation in international forensic science and cold case resolution. What had begun as an isolated, 24-year-old Midwestern cold case in Stark County, Ohio, was formally integrated into international law enforcement symposiums from Interpol in Lyon, France, to Scotland Yard in London. Forensic geneticists and homicide investigators worldwide began adopting the Linwood Protocol, a standardized investigative framework that combined low-template touch DNA extraction, single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP, microarray sequencing, and ethical genetic genealogy workflows to solve long-dormant crimes across international borders. At major forensic science conventions across Europe and North America, research papers detailing the molecular biology breakthroughs achieved in Case File 02-CR 8819 were published in leading international scientific journals. Molecular biologists showcased how the microanalytical techniques developed to isolate Sarah Linwood's killer from degraded skin cells beneath her fingernails could be applied to complex, multi-decade-old evidence stored under suboptimal conditions. The international scientific consensus was clear. The biological decay of historical evidence was no longer an insurmountable barrier to justice, and no violent criminal who left even a handful of skin cells at a crime scene could ever truly outrun the reach of modern genomic technology. Inside the maximum security state penitentiary, the passage of time took on a cold, mechanical finality for the 71-year-old inmate serving life without parole. Within the stark confines of his 9-by-12-foot cell, the external world, and any lingering memory of the false respectability he had cultivated for nearly a quarter of a century had completely evaporated. His days were reduced to the rigid, unyielding cadence of prison life. Mandatory cell counts, sterile communal meals, and silent hours spent staring at the concrete walls. Inmate 881-902 was no longer the cunning mastermind who had successfully evaded law enforcement for 24 years. He was a living cautionary tale, a broken old man whose identity had been permanently replaced by the unassailable mathematical certainty of his own DNA profile. In Stark County, the local community entered a new era characterized by permanent resolution and deep-rooted stability. The local sheriff's department opened the doors to its state-of-the-art regional forensic science and training center, named in honor of Sarah Linwood. The facility served as an operational hub for Midwest law enforcement agencies, offering cutting-edge training in evidence preservation, digital genealogy mapping, and victim-centered investigative approaches. Detectives who had once carried the heavy burden of Sarah's unsolved file now mentored a new generation of investigators, instilling in them the foundational philosophy that every cold case file represents a solemn promise to a victim and a family that will never be abandoned. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the complete journey from unimaginable tragedy to systemic national change brought an overwhelming, enduring sense of peace. The nature preserve off the gravel access road had become a sanctuary of hope and reflection, where local families walked along serene, wooded paths and visited the dark granite memorial stone surrounded by perennial flowers. Standing together beneath the clear autumn sky, Sarah's children looked back on the long, dark 24-year road they had walked. They knew that their mother's victory over the darkness was complete. Her name was forever untainted, her killer was permanently locked away, and her legacy had created an immortal beacon of truth that would continue to bring light and justice to countless families for generations to come. With the arrival of 2027, the institutionalized success of the Linwood Protocol reached its absolute peak, shifting from an extraordinary success story into an essential, foundational pillar of modern global jurisprudence. The specialized methodologies first refined inside the Stark County Crime Lab were officially integrated into the core operating procedures of federal investigative agencies, international police coalitions, and forensic institutes across 5 continents. Cold cases that had languished in dark, dusty vaults for 30, 40, or even 50 years across Europe, Australia, and the Americas were systematically unsealed and processed through advanced genomic sequencing pipelines. The phrase "the Linwood effect" entered the lexicon of legal scholars, criminologists, and investigative journalists worldwide, symbolizing the complete, unyielding triumph of microscopic biological truth over decades of human deceit, cover-ups, and calculated silence. At the international level, the Linwood Protocol established a new precedent for interjurisdictional cooperation and public-private genetic database ethics. National legislative bodies used the legal battlegrounds fought in the Stark County courtroom as the definitive model for balancing privacy rights with violent crime resolution. Specialized international task forces were formed to handle historical cross-border homicides, utilizing high-throughput genomic platforms to identify long-lost victims and unmask aging perpetrators who had crossed state lines or international borders to escape detection. What had started as an agonizing local mystery in a quiet corner of Ohio had permanently rewritten the rules of forensic investigation, ensuring that no geographic boundary or temporal distance could ever again provide shelter to those who committed violent acts against the innocent. Deep within the high-security block of the state penitentiary, the physical and psychological toll of absolute confinement brought the 71-year-old inmate into his final, inescapable reality. Deprived of the ability to manipulate those around him or project a false image of suburban morality, he spent his remaining days inside a cold, silent world bounded entirely by concrete and steel. Inmate 881-902 watched on a small wall-mounted screen as news broadcasts regularly featured retired detectives, forensic geneticists, and Sarah Linwood's adult children discussing the ongoing global impact of her case. He was forced to endure the ultimate defeat for a narcissist. His calculated 24-year deception had not only failed to save him, but it had turned his name into a universal symbol of pathetic, cowardly failure. A man stripped of his dignity, disowned by his bloodline, and forgotten by society, while his victim's memory shone brighter with each passing day. In Stark County, the Sarah Linwood Regional Forensic Science and Training Center stood as a vibrant, world-class testament to innovation, resilience, and community dedication. Young detectives, molecular biologists, and legal scholars from every corner of the globe gathered regularly in its state-of-the-art auditoriums to analyze the precise chain of custody, probabilistic genotyping models, and investigative strategies that had solved Case File 02, CR 8819. The local sheriff's department, once burdened by the weight of an unsolved cold case, now operated as one of the most respected law enforcement hubs in North America. Officers no longer looked at cold cases with a sense of quiet resignation. Instead, every unsealed folder was viewed as an active mission backed by the full force of modern science and an unwavering moral commitment to the victims and their surviving families. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the passage of time brought the ultimate realization of emotional peace, fulfillment, and enduring victory. The nature preserve off the gravel access road had become a sanctuary not just for their family, but for an entire community that had refused to surrender to despair. Sitting together on the wooden bench beside the polished dark granite memorial stone, surrounded by tall oak trees rustling softly under a warm sun, they knew that their mother's legacy was forever secured. Her tragic death in 2002 was no longer the end of her story. It was the spark that ignited a global movement for justice, dragging thousands of hidden phantoms out of the shadows and delivering answers to countless grieving families across the world. The dark fog that had once shrouded the Ohio countryside was gone forever, replaced by an eternal, unyielding light of truth that would burn brightly for generations to come. As 2027 progressed, the extraordinary institutional evolution driven by the resolution of the Sarah Linwood murder reached an unprecedented international milestone. The complex forensic methodology that had successfully brought a 24-year cold case deadlock in Stark County, Ohio, to an airtight, scientifically unassailable conviction was officially adopted by Interpol and police coalitions across more than 60 nations. Dubbed the Linwood Protocol, this unified framework integrated high-throughput single-nucleotide polymorphism, SNP, microarray sequencing, ethical public genetic genealogy mapping, and low-template touch DNA recovery procedures into a single, standardized global operational procedure. What had begun as an agonizing local crime on a foggy access road in 2002 was now universally recognized as the foundational cornerstone of 21st-century international homicide investigation. Across Europe, Asia, and the Americas, federal law enforcement agencies established dedicated Linwood units, specialized forensic divisions tasked exclusively with re-examining dormant, multi-decade-old cold cases using advanced genomic technology. In major metropolitan centers and rural provinces alike, cold case vaults that had sat untouched for up to half a century were systematically unsealed. Teams of forensic geneticists, working in tandem with veteran homicide detectives, processed preserved microscopic samples from archived physical evidence, generating digital DNA profiles that were cross-referenced against global public genealogical registries. Within months, historical homicides, unidentified human remains cases, and serial violent crimes dating back to the 1970s and 1980s began yielding long-delayed answers, triggering a wave of high-profile arrests that reverberated across international news headlines daily. Deep inside the maximum security wing of the state penitentiary, the psychological weight of total, unyielding isolation continued its silent, relentless erosion of the 71-year-old inmate serving life without the possibility of parole. Completely stripped of his former social standing, his comfortable suburban lifestyle, and the carefully constructed facade of a loving family man, his world was now permanently bounded by cinder block walls, heavy steel doors, and the cold routine of institutional guard patrols. On the small television mounted in the cell block day room, news reports frequently featured global law enforcement officials citing the Sarah Linwood case as the ultimate catalyst for the world's greatest forensic revolution. The calculated 24-year cover-up he had maintained with arrogant confidence had not only failed to protect him, but it had ultimately turned his identity into an international symbol of pathetic, cowardly deceit, a man forgotten by the outside world, while his victim's memory illuminated the path to justice for millions. In Stark County, the Sarah Linwood Regional Forensic Science and Training Center expanded its operational campus to accommodate an influx of international law enforcement delegations, scientific researchers, and legal scholars. The facility functioned as a premier global think tank, conducting advanced research into low-template DNA recovery from degraded environmental samples while hosting training seminars on forensic ethics, chain-of-custody protocols, and expert witness testimony. Detectives who had carried the heavy burden of Case File 02, CR 8819 now stood before international audiences as respected instructors, instilling in incoming investigators the unyielding principle that no historical violent crime is ever truly cold as long as physical evidence remains, and that time can never offer shelter to those who commit violent acts against the innocent. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the ultimate fulfillment of their mother's legacy provided a profound, eternal peace that completely transcended the tragic circumstances of her death. The peaceful nature preserve off the gravel access road had become a global sanctuary of hope, where local residents and visiting families of cold case victims gathered near the dark granite memorial stone surrounded by blooming native flora. Sitting together under a clear sky, Sarah's children reflected on the long, 24-year journey from darkness to absolute truth. They knew that their mother's spirit had achieved something monumental. Her name was forever untainted, her murderer was permanently locked away in the dark, and her story had ignited an unquenchable, immortal light of justice that would continue to cut through the deepest fog and protect the innocent for generations to come. By late 2027, the far-reaching structural reform initiated by the resolution of Sarah Linwood's murder had expanded beyond law enforcement and forensic laboratories into the core of the international judicial system. Federal judges, state appellate courts, and legal scholars across multiple continents began establishing specialized evidentiary rules tailored specifically to the presentation of investigative genetic genealogy, IgG, and probabilistic genotyping in capital and cold case trials. The high-profile pretrial litigation in Stark County, where the defense had aggressively, yet unsuccessfully, challenged the chain of custody of frozen 2002 biological samples and the ethical parameters of public genealogical searches, became the universal precedent cited in legal briefs worldwide. Defense motions attempting to suppress DNA matches derived from distant familial linkages were routinely struck down based on the legal framework established in Sarah Linwood's trial, ensuring that complex genetic evidence could be admitted swiftly, efficiently, and with total scientific integrity. At the university level, law schools and forensic science departments established dedicated Linwood Fellowships, offering postdoctoral grants for research into molecular biology, bioethics, and cold case advocacy. Academic journals published extensive peer-reviewed studies analyzing how the integration of single nucleotide polymorphism, SNP, microarray technology, and high-throughput sequencing had effectively closed the loophole of elapsed time in violent crimes. Students from around the world analyzed every transcript, exhibit, and witness testimony from Case File 02, CR 8819, learning not only the technical mechanics of touch DNA extraction from degraded fingernail scrapings, but also the profound ethical responsibility of representing silent victims in a court of law. Inside the maximum security state penitentiary, the 71-year-old convict's world contracted even further as his health began a slow, irreversible decline. The arrogance that had once allowed him to walk among Sarah's family for 24 years with a serene, unbothered smile was entirely gone, replaced by a bitter, hollow resignation. He spent his days in near total silence, confined to his narrow cell or sitting alone in the corner of the recreation yard under the watchful eye of armed guards. Surrounding inmates, fully aware of his identity and the cold-blooded betrayal of his own family, offered him no camaraderie or respect. The news reports that periodically aired in the dayroom, showing young law students studying his trial or foreign police departments using the Linwood Protocol to arrest cold case killers, served as a relentless, psychological punishment, proving that every attempt he had made to cover his tracks had only served to build the very weapon that permanently destroyed him. In Stark County, the local community continued to bloom with a renewed sense of pride and emotional resilience. The Sarah Linwood Regional Forensic Science and Training Center hosted its first international symposium on cold case resolution, bringing together hundreds of delegates, including forensic scientists, homicide investigators, software engineers, and victims' rights advocates. The event concluded with a candlelight procession from the county courthouse to the peaceful nature preserve off the gravel access road, where an idling car and a dark, foggy night had once symbolized an unsolved Midwestern horror. Hundreds of people now stood together under a clear, starlit sky, honoring Sarah's memory and celebrating the triumph of human persistence over decades of deceit. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the passage of another year brought a quiet, deep-seated satisfaction that allowed them to live fully in the present, free from the lingering ghosts of 2002. Through the Sarah Linwood Foundation, they continued to provide financial grants to small-town police departments struggling to afford genetic genealogy testing, directly contributing to the resolution of dozens of forgotten homicides across the country. Standing together on the wooden bench at the nature preserve, watching the sunlight glint off the polished dark granite memorial stone, they felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. Their mother's death was no longer an open wound or a terrifying mystery. It had become the catalyst for a global movement of truth and accountability, an immortal light that would continue to guide the lost out of the dark for generations to come. As 2027 drew toward its close, the systemic impact of the Sarah Linwood case reached its ultimate realization in the realm of international human rights and cold case victim advocacy. The global adoption of the Linwood Protocol was no longer merely a law enforcement trend. It had been formally recognized by international legal bodies as an essential framework for upholding justice for victims of non-statutory violent crimes. Human rights organizations and legal coalitions across multiple continents published sweeping reports emphasizing that the right to truth, the fundamental entitlement of surviving family members to know the precise circumstances of a loved one's murder, was now realistically attainable even decades after a crime occurred, thanks to the molecular breakthroughs perfected in Stark County, Ohio. In law enforcement agencies across the globe, the psychological approach to historical case files underwent a permanent, irreversible evolution. The long-standing, defeatist belief that an unsolved case inevitably loses its investigative value as witnesses age, memories fade, and paper files yellow was completely shattered. Homicide divisions worldwide established permanent, automated archival monitoring systems designed to continuously queue historical physical evidence for retesting whenever higher sensitivity genomic sequencing kits reached the market. Detective divisions no longer spoke of cold cases as dead ends, but rather as dormant files waiting for their technological turn. The unyielding perseverance demonstrated by the Stark County investigators, who had preserved microscopic fingernail scrapings in a freezer locker for 24 years, became the universal standard of care for physical evidence management in modern police departments. Deep within the high-security block of the state correctional facility, the physical decline of the 71-year-old convict entered its final, quiet phase. Isolated in the infirmary wing, far removed from the bustling community he had once manipulated with calculated charm, his world had shrunk to the sterile hum of medical monitors and the silent gaze of correctional officers stationed outside his door. The arrogant illusion of control that had defined his adult life, the narcissistic belief that he could murder a family member, attend her memorial, share meals with her grieving children, and carry the secret to his grave, had dissolved into absolute irrelevance. He was an inmate serving life without parole, stripped of his family, his legacy, and his freedom, surrounded only by the unyielding weight of the truth he had spent a quarter of a century trying to hide. In Stark County, the local community continued to flourish as a national beacon of healing, innovation, and unwavering resolve. The Sarah Linwood Regional Forensic Science and Training Center celebrated its second anniversary by announcing a new international fellowship program designed to train forensic geneticists from developing nations, ensuring that cutting-edge cold case resolution techniques would be accessible to under-resourced jurisdictions worldwide. The peaceful nature preserve off the gravel access road remained a cherished local landmark, a place where residents walked under the canopy of towering oaks, children played in the open meadows, and visitors paused in quiet reflection near the dark granite memorial stone. The land that had once held the dark fog of an unsolved horror was now filled with life, light, and enduring tranquility. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the journey that had begun on that terrifying, foggy morning in October 2002 reached its complete, golden horizon. Standing together at the edge of the nature preserve as a soft sunset painted the Ohio sky in shades of amber and rose, they looked out over the quiet landscape with hearts full of profound peace. They had fought through 24 years of silence, unraveled a nightmare of unthinkable betrayal, and turned their grief into a powerful force that was actively saving lives and delivering justice across the globe. Their mother's name was no longer a symbol of tragedy, but an immortal banner of truth, scientific triumph, and unyielding familial love, a bright, eternal light that had permanently conquered the dark. The transition of the Linwood Protocol into a permanent, globally recognized standard marked the opening of a brand new chapter in the history of international jurisprudence, one where the concept of a cold case became an obsolete relic of an earlier, less enlightened era. Across the United States, Europe, and Asia, state crime facilities and private genomic laboratories established automated, high-throughput pipelines that operated 24 hours a day, continuously reprocessing archived biological samples from cold cases going back over half a century. In cities where unsolved homicides had once accumulated dust in subterranean basement vaults for decades, specialized multi-agency units worked through backlog files with breathtaking speed, identifying unknown perpetrators, exonerating the wrongfully accused, and returning long-lost answers to aging family members who had given up hope of ever seeing justice served in their lifetimes. The sheer speed with which modern molecular biology dismantled decades of calculated deception sent shockwaves through criminal subcultures worldwide. Violent offenders who had lived for 30 or 40 years under the cozy, arrogant assumption that their youth, cleverness, or luck had granted them permanent immunity found themselves suddenly confronted by teams of federal agents and municipal detectives bearing arrest warrants derived from microscopic skin cells left behind in the distant past. The psychological impact was immediate and total. The comfort of time was gone. There was no statute of limitations on biological truth, no geographic border that could insulate a killer from a database, and no amount of suburban respectability that could shield a sociopath. Once modern high-throughput genomic sequencers converted invisible tissue into an unassailable digital signature. Inside the high-security infirmary wing of the state correctional facility, the 71-year-old inmate serving life, without the possibility of parole, lay suspended in a quiet, solitary twilight. Stripped of his former health, his social status, and the deceptive charm that had allowed him to walk among Sarah Linwood's grieving family for nearly a quarter of a century, his world had shrunk to the sterile rhythm of medical monitoring equipment and the unyielding watch of prison guards. Every evening, as news broadcasts echoed down the hallway detailing the arrest of yet another historical offender through the Linwood Protocol, he was forced to confront the absolute, total failure of his own cover-up. The crime he had committed in the damp fog of an October night in 2002 had not only destroyed his own life and freedom, but it had become the single greatest catalyst for unmasking hidden predators across the globe. In Stark County, Ohio, the local community embraced its role as the cradle of a global forensic revolution with a quiet, profound dignity. The Sarah Linwood Regional Forensic Science and Training Center expanded its research facilities to incorporate cutting-edge artificial intelligence models designed to map complex, multi-generational family trees across international boundaries, cutting down the time required to trace investigative genetic genealogy matches from months to mere hours. The local sheriff's department, once burdened by the weight of a 24-year deadlock, stood as an international beacon of investigative excellence, welcoming visiting task forces from around the world to study the precise chain of custody, evidence preservation, and community outreach protocols that had brought Case File 02, CR 8819 to a victorious conclusion. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the journey that had begun with a devastating phone call on a foggy autumn morning in 2002 reached its ultimate, timeless resting place. Sitting together on the wooden bench at the nature preserve off the old gravel access road, surrounded by tall oak trees rustling softly under a clear sky, they looked upon the dark granite memorial stone with hearts completely cleansed of bitterness and fear. Through their courage, resilience, and unyielding refusal to give up, their mother's name had been transformed from a tragic local headline into an immortal symbol of hope, truth, and justice. The fog that had once shrouded the Ohio countryside was gone forever, replaced by an eternal light that would continue to guide the innocent and illuminate the darkest corners of the human heart for generations to come. As the global implementation of advanced forensic genomics solidified into a permanent pillar of international law enforcement, the historical legacy of the Sarah Linwood investigation reached a milestone of profound historical significance. In major capitals across the world, legal scholars and forensic experts gathered to commemorate the transformative shift that had reshaped criminal justice over the preceding years. The resolution of the 2002 Stark County homicide was no longer analyzed merely as a solved cold case, but as the turning point where modern science permanently closed the loophole of elapsed time. Across jurisdictions where thousands of violent crimes had once lay buried under decades of dust, the systematic application of high-throughput genomic sequencing continued to yield continuous breakthroughs, systematically dismantling cold case backlogs and offering definitive resolution to families who had endured generations of agonizing uncertainty. Inside the maximum security infirmary block of the State Correctional Facility, the final chapter of the 71-year-old inmate's life arrived with quiet, absolute finality. Confined to a sterile hospital bed and monitored by automated medical equipment, the convicted killer spent his last remaining hours stripped of every illusion that had once sustained his narcissistic existence. The suburban respectability he had cultivated, the false warmth he had displayed at family gatherings, and the arrogant belief that he could take a life and carry the secret to his grave had all been systematically erased by a handful of microscopic skin cells recovered from beneath his victim's fingernails. As his physical strength ebbed away in total isolation, no family members arrived to hold his hand or offer words of comfort. His bloodline had formally disowned him, his community had condemned him, and his name remained forever etched into legal history as a symbol of tragic, sociopathic betrayal. At the Sarah Linwood Regional Forensic Science and Training Center in Stark County, a new generation of homicide investigators and forensic geneticists gathered for the unveiling of an expansive national digital archive. The platform housed detailed case studies, evidence handling protocols, and bioethical guidelines derived directly from the 2026 investigation, providing real-time data access to law enforcement agencies across North America and Europe. Detectives who had carried the heavy burden of case file 02 CR 8819 stood alongside young scientists, demonstrating how the integration of touch DNA extraction, probabilistic genotyping, and ethical genetic genealogy had created a seamless operational pipeline. The center stood as an active, living monument, a state-of-the-art facility where the lessons learned from a 24-year nightmare were continuously utilized to protect the innocent and expose hidden predators. In the quiet, picturesque countryside of Stark County, the autumn landscape surrounding the nature preserve off the gravel access roads sparkled under a warm, golden sun. The dark, suffocating fog that had hung over the area since October 2002 was long gone, replaced by a deep, enduring serenity that enveloped the entire community. Families walked along the tree-lined paths, children played near the open meadows, and visitors routinely paused near the dark granite memorial stone to leave fresh flowers and pay quiet tribute. The site of a once horrifying crime had been completely reclaimed by nature, peace, and truth, standing as a permanent testament to the power of human persistence and the unyielding strength of a community that refused to let a victim be forgotten. For Sarah Linwood's adult children, the complete arc of their long journey from unimaginable trauma to nationwide advocacy culminated in a profound, unbreakable sense of spiritual peace. Standing together at the edge of the preserve, looking out over the quiet landscape where their mother's memory now shone with untainted clarity, they knew that their fight had achieved something truly extraordinary. They had unmasked a monster hiding in plain sight, rewritten the future of forensic science, and provided an eternal light of hope for millions of grieving families across the world. Sarah Linwood was not merely remembered as a victim of a dark 2002 crime. She had become an immortal beacon of truth, justice, and unyielding familial love, a light that would burn brightly and cut through the deepest darkness for all time. The news of the 71-year-old inmate's death inside the maximum security infirmary reached Stark County on a brisk, clear late autumn morning, bringing the absolute, final curtain down on the physical existence of the man who had murdered Sarah Linwood in 2002. There were no weeping relatives at the gates of the correctional facility, no formal memorial services planned by his disowned extended family, and no dramatic statements issued by his defense counsel. His remains were quietly processed by the state examiner's office in accordance with standard protocol for unassigned prison fatalities, a stark, sterile end for a man who had spent nearly a quarter of a century living behind an elaborate mask of suburban respectability and calculated, sociopathic innocence. For the local residents of Stark County and the law enforcement officers who had carried the crushing weight of Case File 02, CR 8819 across 2 decades, his passing brought no shock or renewed grief. It was simply the silent, mathematical closing of a ledger that had already been settled in a court of law. The prosecutor who had led the relentless 2026 trial issued a brief, measured statement to assembled journalists outside the courthouse. The defendant's life ended in absolute